Chapter 1629. Under the 10,000 split sword scars, tens of thousands of ghosts roared. The cold aura in the air seemed to be drawn in and mixed with each other, making the surroundings even more gloomy and terrifying. It was as if there were countless evil ghosts roaring and roaring in the surroundings, directly attacking one's soul. Under such circumstances, ordinary cultivators would often lose their mind or even be scared out of their wits. However, Chen Zong was not. Such evil could not shake Chen Zong at all. No matter what you do, I will remain calm and unruffled. The myriad ghost sword king's red eyes flashed with surprise, and then his smile became even more obvious. Very good. The more outstanding the opponent's performance, the more interested he was in killing him and refining his soul into the myriad ghost sword. His myriad ghost sword was still at the level of a saint artifact and had yet to evolve into a semi-divine artifact. It lacked a ghost king who could command all the ghosts in the myriad ghost sword. If this person was outstanding enough, he might be able to become the ghost king, allowing his myriad ghost sword to break through the limit and become a semi-divine artifact. At that time, his cultivation would also be affected, and he would break through the limit to become a half-step great saint expert. His strength would greatly increase, and no one on the upper Yuan Sky sword ranking would be his match. Even ordinary half-step great saints would not be his match. Thinking of this, the myriad ghost sword king could not suppress the excitement in his heart. He activated the myriad ghost sword and released an even more terrifying power, attacking in all directions and trapping Chen Zong like a prison. Dark and gloomy surrounded Chen Zong as the temperature plummeted. The cold and gloomy aura was extremely oppressive. Countless ferocious evil spirits roamed in all directions. Their pitch-black ghost claws emitted an extremely cold and sharp aura as they attacked from all directions, as if they wanted to grab Chen Zong and tear him apart. His body trembled slightly, as if a mountain was shaking, and an extremely terrifying power was released in an instant, directly shattering all the evil ghost claws that grabbed him. The might of this power was simply like the eruption of an ancient volcano. It was terrifying to the extreme. What vigorous blood chi! What a powerful physique! The myriad ghost sword and the myriad ghost sword king seemed to be one. The ghost claw on the myriad ghost sword also seemed to be the myriad ghost sword king's palm. The power that Chen Zong released in an instant was extremely powerful. His chi and blood were extremely vigorous. It was obvious that he had an amazing body refining cultivation. The myriad ghost sword king was both shocked and delighted. He had a powerful soul and an extremely exuberant blood essence. If he could refine his soul, he would be able to feed on his opponent's blood essence and directly nurture a ghost king to sit in the myriad ghost sword. It would then transform into a semi-divine tool and nourish himself, allowing him to successfully break through his current cultivation limit and become a half-step great saint expert. Kill. The myriad ghost sword king became even more determined to kill this person. Since that was the case, he couldn't delay any longer to avoid any more trouble. With a shake of his sword, streaks of terrifying and direct pitch-black sword chi that burned with black ghost fire instantly tore through the air like a storm or a meteor. They carried an extremely terrifying and cold-killing intent as they mercilessly charged towards Chen Zong. No one in the outside world could see because both the myriad ghost sword king and Chen Zong were covered by a black smoke-like fiery aura. It looked extremely terrifying. Dead, this person is dead for sure. Cold Mountain Sword King clenched his fists, secretly excited. Black Mountain Old Man and the other two in the distance were also shocked. Ghost Shadow and Blood Sword King were even more delighted. Revenge would finally be avenged. Chen Zong's expression was slightly grave. The myriad ghost sword king's sword had arrived. Countless ghost fire sword chi were eerie and extremely powerful. It was obvious that the myriad ghost sword king didn't intend to hold back and wanted to destroy his soul, flesh, and blood. At the same time, Chen Zong was also excited. This was the first time he had encountered such a strong opponent with mysterious means. Unsheathing the sunken night sword, Chen Zong raised it. It was darker and darker than here, and countless sword lights streaked across the void. The sword lights were densely packed and overlapped, as if they were endless. Chain. Under this one sword strike, the myriad ghost sword king's 100% strength attack was weakened layer by layer and finally shattered. He actually blocked it. The 1,000 ghost sword king was slightly taken aback. His cultivation was at the peak of the 9th heaven saint realm, and the secret art he cultivated was a top-grade saint-grade secret art. Moreover, he had cultivated it to perfection. His sword strike with 100% of his strength was terrifying, but it still couldn't do anything to his opponent. With the myriad ghost sword king's eyesight, he could naturally see the exquisiteness of his opponent's move. Kill! With a low roar, the myriad ghost sword king attacked again. This time, not only did he use 100% of his strength, but he also displayed his most prized sword skill. The sword slashed out, turning into a giant ghost claw that pierced through the void. It seemed to tear the void apart, but at the same time, it also seemed to penetrate the void as it mercilessly attacked Chen Zong. Layers of flames burned on the ghost claw, burning fiercely. It was extremely terrifying and cold, as if it wanted to freeze and burn Chen Zong and destroy all vitality. It also seemed like it wanted to drag Chen Zong's soul into eternal hell. However, although this ghost claw was powerful, it couldn't do anything to the chain sword and was immediately weakened layer by layer. Ghost Shadow. With a low roar, the evil ghost's roar became even more intense. In an instant, countless ghost shadows spread out and gathered towards the center, merging into a giant ghost. It stood there, exuding a terrifying aura, causing the chill it exuded to become even more terrifying. The giant ghost shadow was like a mountain, suppressing all directions. The power it exuded seemed to form a force field that completely covered Chen Zong. It also seemed like it wanted to penetrate Chen Zong's body, immobilizing him. Interesting, Chen Zong thought. Although this move did bring him some pressure and threat, it wasn't enough. The intensity of the pressure was still not enough. The giant ghost shadow struck down with its palm, exuding an extremely terrifying pressure, as if it wanted to destroy Chen Zong's soul, flesh, and blood. However, this palm strike missed. Chen Zong's figure was extremely agile, like a wisp of wind, invisible and formless. Even the myriad ghost sword king's ultimate move couldn't lock onto him. Hong hong hong. It was as if the earth was quaking and the mountains were shaking. Inside the ghost domain, Chen Zong was constantly being attacked by the gigantic ghostly figure. Each of its attacks was extremely terrifying and could easily kill an ordinary peak 9th heaven saint realm cultivator, but it couldn't do anything to Chen Zong because it couldn't hit him. The myriad ghost sword king's expression became more and more solemn. It seemed like it wouldn't be easy to kill this person. It seems like this king has no choice but to use his ultimate move. The scarlet light in the myriad ghost sword king's eyes intensified as he made up his mind. He had to pay a price to use his ultimate move. Normally, he wouldn't want to use it at all. However, it seemed like he had no choice but to use it now. As long as he could kill this brat and refine his soul into the myriad ghost sword, becoming the ghost king that ruled over all ghosts, the price he had to pay would be nothing compared to the reward. In an instant, the myriad ghost sword king's blood seemed to boil. Even his tyrannical spiritual force fluctuated and poured into the myriad ghost sword in his hand. The myriad ghost sword was like a shark that smelled blood. The aura it emitted became even more ferocious, as if it had transformed from an evil spirit into a malicious spirit. It was terrifying to the extreme, causing Chen Zong's expression to change slightly. At the same time, Chen Zong became even more excited. Only a strong enough opponent would have value in tempering himself. If the opponent was too weak, it would be completely useless. It's your honor to be able to see this king use this move. The myriad ghost sword king's voice was erratic, but it contained extreme killing intent. It was as if a malicious spirit was roaring in one's ears, causing one's mind to be filled with illusions. Ghost realm. The two words seemed to have penetrated the endless void from hell. The myriad ghost sword king's sword fell from the sky. It was like a meteor burning with ghost fire falling from the sky. The huge ghost fire meteor covered the void in all directions and compressed it, making it extremely heavy. It was like a domain, suppressing everything. Chunzong found that his formless sky-wind body art had lost its effect at this moment. No matter where he went, he couldn't avoid this attack. Unless he could cultivate the formless sky-wind body art to the perfection stage and reach the true formless stage, it would be as if he could break free from the shackles and become unrestrained. However, Chunzong had just broken through to the profound stage not long ago and was still unearthing the potential of the perfection stage. There was still a big gap between him and the perfection stage. What's more, the formless sky wind was a divine ability of the 10th grade secret method. It was very mysterious and difficult to comprehend. Most Saint Realm experts could only cultivate it to the entry stage, or at most, the minor success stage. Only those peerless geniuses had a chance of reaching the perfection stage. As for cultivating it to the perfection stage, it was more than 100 times more difficult than reaching the perfection stage. However, being unable to avoid it didn't mean that Chunzong couldn't resist it. The formless sky wind was only a part of Chunzong's strength. Since he couldn't avoid it, he would break it with the sword in his hand. Chunzong raised his head and his eyes flashed with an extremely sharp cold light. Traces of black light spread out from the sunken knight sword, making the sword look deeper and deeper. He raised his sword and slashed toward the sky. Countless sword lights, as majestic as clouds and as vast as water, continuously rushed into the sky and instantly turned into one sword. One sword turned into 10,000 swords. 10,000 swords turned into one sword. Infinite. The profundity and power contained in the sword was much stronger than before. The infinite sword technique was a sword technique created by Chunzong. There was no level limit. As long as Chunzong's cultivation continued to improve and his understanding of the sword technique continued to increase, its power would continue to increase and become more powerful. In the future, it was not impossible for each sword to reach the power of the extreme stage. The sword slashed out with endless mystery. Compared to the ghost fire that was like a meteor, it seemed very weak, but the aura it contained was not weak at all. On the contrary, the infinite sword seemed to be able to penetrate everything. Kill. Chapter 1630. The will-o'-the-wisp storm raged in all directions. In an instant, even the tyrannical aura of the 10,000 sword scars was dispersed. In the distance, everyone was shocked. This battle was unexpectedly intense. The three old men looked solemn. This kid's strength was unexpectedly strong. He could actually fight with the myriad ghost sword king to this extent. The aftershock was so powerful that it made their hearts palpitate. If they were caught in the aftershock, they would be heavily injured even if they didn't die. They saw a fine sword light breaking out from the ground and piercing through the huge ghost fire meteor. Shortly after, it made a sharp turn in the air and shot down. Fast as light. Fast as lightning. The myriad ghost sword king felt a chill in his heart. He felt a piercing pain coming from his forehead, and his expression changed greatly. Without hesitation, the myriad ghost sword king erupted with his full strength. Ghost shadows overlapped. In an instant, the myriad ghost sword king's shadows turned into over 100 densely packed in all directions. It was hard to distinguish the real from the fake. Every one of them looked lifelike, as if they were real. But under the envelopment of Chunzong's heart domain, it was already clear where his true body was. All illusions were difficult to confuse. Even though the myriad ghost sword king executed his movement technique, the sense of danger in his heart didn't weaken. He watched as the sword light tore through the sky like lightning. It contained an indomitable sharpness and unavoidable profundity as it headed straight for his real body. The myriad ghost sword king was sure that his movement technique couldn't confuse the other party. Boom! The myriad ghost sword king erupted with astonishing power, as if it wanted to shatter everything. As the sword slashed out, the pitch-black sword light burned with blazing ghost fire, as if it wanted to burn the sky. The sword light shattered. Without waiting for the myriad ghost sword king to react, Chen Zong slashed out again. At the same time, he activated his heart domain and myriad streams force field. The ordinary slash was still an infinite slash. Although the angle was different, the power didn't decrease in the slightest. It directly made the myriad ghost sword king's body tremble, as he felt his hair stand on end. Especially when he was hit by thousands of strong torrents. In an instant, his limbs and body seemed to be bound, and he could not move at all. He could only watch as the mysterious and sharp sword light came at him. Danger. Incomparably dangerous. It was extremely dangerous. He unleashed all of his power, but he was unable to break through the torrents. Strengthened by the heart domain, the torrent's might was multiplied. It was extremely tough and wouldn't collapse so easily. You forced me to do this. The myriad ghost sword king's face was ferocious, and his eyes were filled with extreme cruelty. Although his body and limbs were unable to move, he still spat out a mouthful of blood essence. The blood essence was blood red, but it was filled with traces of black aura. It was the power of the soul. This mouthful of essence blood, which contained soul energy, directly landed on the 10,000 ghost sword. It was as if the seal on the 10,000 ghost sword had been unlocked, and it seemed to have awakened the evil ghost king slumbering in the abyss. An extremely terrifying aura erupted from the 10,000 ghost sword. It was like an ancient volcano that had been accumulating power for countless years erupting in an instant. An extremely terrifying roar, which seemed to come from the deepest part of hell, rang out, causing everyone in the distance to have a splitting headache. It felt as if their souls were about to be shattered. Chen Zong received the most direct and intense impact. He felt as if his soul was about to be pulled into the deepest hell and torn apart by thousands of ghosts. Fortunately, Chen Zong's soul was very powerful, and his soul fire was also very vigorous. Under the burning of his soul fire, he actually managed to block this terrifying roar. However, this was only the beginning. It was the prelude to the 10,000 ghost sword's astonishing power. Endless black smoke surged endlessly. It was as if the boundary of hell had been broken in an instant, and a door had been opened. The monstrous black smoke and ghost fire constantly poured into the myriad ghost sword king's body, causing his aura to skyrocket. It instantly multiplied, and directly shattered the 1,000 torrents of the myriad ghost force field. Die! The muscles on his body seemed to have swelled up by a large size, and his entire body was filled with Black Will-o'-the-Wisp. He looked like a ghost king that had charged out of the boundary of death from the depths of hell. His might was unparalleled and endless, causing everything in the surroundings to sink into oblivion. Along with the terrifying roar of 10,000 ghosts, the void seemed to shatter. The myriad ghost sword king's right arm suddenly stretched out, turning into an incomparably huge flame surrounded by endless black ghost fire. It was as if it wanted to incinerate all life between heaven and earth as it rushed towards Chen Zong. 5 extremely sharp pitch-black ghost claws abruptly shot out, tearing numerous cracks in the void. The cracks seemed as if they would never dissipate, and they were suffused with a shocking and monstrous gloominess and coldness. Each of those claws was like an unsheathed sword that tore through the sky, displaying the myriad ghost sword king's astonishing attainments in the way of the sword. Compared to everything before, this move was the real killing move. It was a move that required one to pay a great price. The myriad ghost sword king never thought that he would use this move here. Even in that instant, many thoughts flashed through his mind. For example, he must imprison the soul of the person who forced him to pay a heavy price to use this move forever and torture her with ghost fire for 100 years. He must also torture Ghost Shadow and Bloodsword, who asked for a favor from him to kill. He must not even let her 2 friends go. If it wasn't for that damned old woman who wanted him to repay the favor, he wouldn't have to come here and pay such a heavy price to face this person. However, all of this had to be done after he killed this person. Facing this attack, it was as if the 5 Ghost King swordsmen from hell had launched an earth-shattering attack. Chunzong's hair stood on end. A threat. A great threat. Such a threat was even greater than the Heaven Almighty Sword King. If he couldn't block it, he might be killed. He didn't expect this person to burst out with such an attack that was enough to threaten his life. The Genesis Sword Energy Technique was fully activated. The power of Lingwu burst out. To be on the safe side, Chunzong even activated the power of the unbreakable golden body. Golden flame patterns instantly covered his entire body, emitting a layer of golden halo, making him look like a god. He raised the sunken knight sword high up. Countless sword chi, sword light, and sword radiance appeared around him. Each of them contained a terrifying power that seemed to be able to tear apart everything in the world. Heaven and earth were in a line. The strongest move was performed in that instant. Endless power flowed into the sunken knight's sword like a raging sea. As the sword slashed out, endless sword chi, sword radiance, and sword radiance all flowed into the sunken knight's sword in an instant, turning into a thread-like sword radiance that tore through the void silently. This was the sword that had gathered all of Chunzong's power. It was the strongest sword. It was a sword that could only be killed. It pressed forward courageously, and there was no turning back. As the sword slashed out, the surrounding light became increasingly dim. Its sharpness made everything in the world unable to withstand it. In just an instant, 5 extremely terrifying ghost claws that were like heavenly swords that could split the earth came into contact with the sword radiance. There was no explosion, nor was there any big movement. It was just like cutting through tofu. The sword radiance of the line of heaven and earth cut through the ghost claws with irresistible force and continued to move forward. Whether it was the Genesis Sword Energy Technique's sharpness that could split heaven and earth, or the sharpness of the line of heaven and earth that was extremely condensed, or the trace of the mystery of tearing that Chunzong had obtained from comprehending the infinite crack sword will hear, all of them made the power of this sword reach an astonishing extreme. The 1,000 Ghost Sword King's attack that he had paid a heavy price for was indeed extremely powerful. However, compared to Chunzong, who had burst out all of his power, there was still a big gap. Faced with this seemingly thin, thread-like sword radiance, the 1,000 Ghost Sword King was extremely shocked. It couldn't be resisted. Even though he had paid a heavy price to burst out such a powerful force, he still couldn't resist it. It cut through the ghost claws with irresistible force, and in an instant, it cut through the fluctuating black ghost fire smoke outside the 1,000 Ghost Sword King's body. It pierced through from the other side and disappeared into the void, leaving only a tiny scratch that slowly healed. One sword. Just this one sword had cut through the 1,000 Ghost Sword King's strongest attack, and even cut through his body. The extremely terrifying sword chi wreaked havoc and destroyed his vitality. Who are you? Feeling his vitality fading away at an astonishing speed, the 1,000 Ghost Sword King knew that he wouldn't be able to survive. However, before he died, he still wanted to know who the other party was and how he could have such terrifying strength. My name is Chunzong. Chunzong fulfilled the 1,000 Ghost Sword King's last wish before his death. As soon as his voice fell, his figure flashed and turned into an invisible and colorless wind. He swiftly flew in the direction of Old Man Black Mountain and the other 2. Everyone was still immersed in the intense battle and the shock of the 1,000-ghost Sword King's death. They were still in a daze when Chen Zong flew past them. Not good. Run. Old Man Black Mountain and the other two were not weak sword Dao experts after all. They quickly regained their senses. Seeing Chen Zong using his movement technique, they immediately knew that he was going to kill them. Their expressions changed drastically as they hurriedly retreated. At the same time, Old Man Black Mountain and Brushing Willow both pushed Ghost Shadow and Blood Sword King. Ghost Shadow and Blood Sword were stunned. She had originally planned to escape, but because she had lost more than half of her essence blood and hadn't replenished it yet, her reaction was a bit slower than Old Man Black Mountain and Brushing Willow. She also didn't expect that these two people, who could be considered friends, would set her up at the critical moment of life and death. This push was pushing her into the abyss of death. When Ghost Shadow and Blood Sword reacted, they immediately burst out with full speed to escape. However, due to the delay and Chen Zong's explosive speed, they were able to escape at an astonishing speed. Close. He swung his sword. An extremely sharp sword light tore through the sky like an aurora. Ghost Shadow and Blood Sword, whose strength had been greatly reduced, couldn't block Chen Zong's sword chi at all. They were instantly pierced through. Then Chen Zong slashed out twice more. Two terrifying sword lights stretched out like crescent moons. They tore through the sky and mercilessly attacked the fleeing Old Man Black Mountain and Brushing Willow. They were very fast, but Chen Zong's sword was even faster. It reached them in a flash. However, the two of them had also grasped life-saving trump cards. They instantly used them, and the shadow of a Black Mountain covered the Black Mountain Elder, blocking the attack of the sword. Their speed increased rapidly, and they quickly left. Brushing Willow was swept away by a ball of azure light. He also fled at several times the speed. Chapter 1631. The Black Mountain Elder and the Fu Lu swordsman used their trump cards to escape. They were extremely fast and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Chen Zong did not chase after them. He landed quickly and kept the Ghost Shadow Blood Sword's sword and storage ring. Then, he rushed towards the 10,000 cracks sword scar. There was also the storage ring of the sword Dao expert who looked like a ghost king. Chen Zong. I seem to have heard this name before. It's a little familiar. Young, not from the upper primordial realm. Seems to be from the Taixin realm or the Xianyuan realm. His name is Chen Zong. Extremely powerful in the way of the sword, all sorts of information seemed to have been connected and turned into a bolt of lightning. It tore through everyone's mind and a thought flashed across everyone's mind. That was a title. Jiandi. Someone's expression changed as he exclaimed. Is he the person who ignited the 9-colored heavenly flower and was given the title of Jiandi by the king naming pagoda? The Lingwu Emperor has been the best in countless eras but has been surpassed by someone in this era. Is he the legendary Jiandi? Shock. Great shock. Great shock. If it was true, then it would be shocking. Jiandi. The meaning behind these two words was no small matter. Combining all the various titles in the Kinkenford realm, this title represented the number 1 peerless monstrous genius, the number 1 genius of the sword Dao since ancient times. Maybe he was not the number 1 genius in the way of the sword, but he had the potential. The cold mountain swordsman could not help but tremble uncontrollably. A chill rose from the depths of his heart. Jiandi. This person was actually the most talented person since ancient times. He was ranked first on the 9-colored king title tablet, the monstrous sword emperor, and he wanted to provoke such a person. The vast wave sword master was trembling uncontrollably. His face was pale and cold sweat seeped from his forehead. It flowed down his cheeks and his entire body was cold. Previously, he was asking for the so-called secret treasure. He even wanted to attack when the other party refused to give it to him. Fortunately, He didn't really draw his sword and didn't even reveal his killing intent. Otherwise, death would probably be the only thing waiting for him. Fear. Heart palpitations. The vast wave sword master wanted to escape, but he did not dare to do so. He was no longer young and had already lost the fighting spirit that he had in the past. He had lost the sharpness that an outstanding swordsman should have. He had become sly and overly cautious. A swordsman could not be reckless or impulsive, but he could not overthink things. When it's time to make a decision, it's time to make a decision. However, one must also be wise and see one's heart. The vast wave sword master had already lost him, but he didn't even know it. Chen Zong ignored the Han sword master and the Songlong sword master as he flew past them. To him, the two of them were no different from ants. As long as they did not provoke him, he would be safe and sound. However, if they didn't know what was good for them and tried to provoke him, then don't blame him for being merciless and killing them all. A short while later, Chen Zong arrived at the place where the 1,000 Ghosts Sword King was killed. The myriad Ghost Sword King had suffered a severe backlash after his death. Not even his corpse remained. Only a tattered black robe, a storage ring, and a broken sword were left on the ground. Although the robe was not bad, it was also broken and useless. It was basically trash. Chen Zong first kept the storage ring, then grabbed the broken sword. The 1,000 Ghost Sword. An extremely powerful holy weapon, but it was now broken and had lost all its power. However, Chen Zong could still feel the remnants of its ferocious aura. The aura was dark, sinister, cold, and ferocious. It was as if it was connected to hell and wanted to drag people down. However, as time passed, the aura dissipated quickly and became fainter and fainter. This sword was useless, but it was also evil. Chen Zong immediately summoned the purple blaze of devastation and covered the broken 1,000 Ghosts sword. He completely purified the evil aura within and turned it into a piece of scrap metal. It no longer had any value and was thrown away. However, Chen Zong checked the storage ring of the 1,000 Ghosts Sword King carefully. As a sword cultivator and the kind of person who did things according to his whims, who knew how many treasures he had plundered. The collection inside this storage ring was extremely rich, which surprised Chen Zong. However, Chen Zong's wealth was also astonishing. Therefore, other than things that were valuable or useful to him, Chen Zong didn't care too much about other things. After a round of searching, Chen Zong found a piece of black inheritance spiritual jade. This black inheritance spiritual jade was about the size of a fist. It looked like a skull with a ferocious face. It was vivid and lifelike. At first glance, it was as if an evil spirit was about to pounce on you. One could vaguely hear the howls of countless evil spirits, which made people feel as if they were falling straight into hell. However, this kind of mental attack was nothing to Chen Zong. Chen Zong's eyes focused and met the black ghostly face's black hollow eyes. In an instant, an extremely scarlet light shot out from the depths of the ghostly face's eyes. Information surged like a torrent and poured into Chen Zong's mind. For a moment, his divine sea seemed to be dyed and became dark and deep. Countless cold auras filled the air as if it had turned into hell. However, this phenomenon didn't affect Chen Zong in the slightest. 1,000 Ghosts Scripture. When the ghostly face's scarlet light faded, Chen Zong also received its inheritance. This was the fortuitous encounter of the 1,000 Ghosts Sword King in his early years. It was a strange and evil cultivation method. It was a complete set and created the 1,000 Ghosts Sword King's fierce reputation. Chen Zong calmly resisted the impact of the 1,000 cracking sword chi and the cold aura while comprehending the mysteries of the 1,000 Ghosts Scripture. The more he comprehended, the more serious his expression became. It was indeed an extremely evil cultivation method. To cultivate this cultivation method, one needed to condense a natal sacred weapon. The natal sacred weapon condensed by the Thousand Ghosts Sword King was the Thousand Ghosts Sword. This made Chen Zong yearn for it. After all, the natal sacred weapon would be connected to one's bloodline and be extremely compatible with one's bloodline. It could allow one to exert one's strength more thoroughly and even surpass one's limits. Its effect was much more powerful than a sacred weapon of the same level. In addition, the natal sacred weapon would be constantly improved. In this way, one wouldn't have to change to other sacred weapons because of the improvement of one's cultivation base and strength. After all, the longer the sacred weapon was used, the more compatible it would be with one's body and the more convenient it would be. But it was a pity that the 10,000 Ghost Scriptures method of nurturing a natal sacred artifact was too evil. First, one had to find an embryo just like an embryo. This embryo had to be soaked in enough and thick blood essence for 3 years without stopping, so that it would have a preliminary spirituality. This step was fine. There were many ways to obtain blood essence, such as by killing monsters. However, after cultivating the weapon embryo with blood essence, one had to refine it into one's body. Then, one had to refine a large number of souls. Among them, human souls were the most suitable. The cultivated natal sacred weapon would be of the best quality. It was because of this that the Thousand Ghosts Sword King had massacred a city and refined the souls of the people in that city, so that the Thousand Ghosts Sword could be truly formed. The final step was to refine a powerful soul with extraordinary potential into it and nourish it with extremely vigorous essence blood. That soul would become the Ghost King and guard the life-bound saint artifact. At this point, the natal sacred weapon was truly completed. Next, it needed to constantly refine souls and absorb blood essence so that the natal sacred weapon's power and quality would continue to improve. Evil. The Thousand Ghosts Scriptures process of cultivating the natal sacred weapon was too evil. Most importantly, the natal sacred weapon cultivated in this way would be a Thousand Ghosts sacred weapon. Chen Zong didn't like its ghastly appearance. If he didn't like it, it wouldn't be suitable. If it wasn't suitable, it wouldn't be good no matter how good it was. The purple limitless incineration flames immediately surged out. The mysterious ancient flame refining art was completely activated to the limit, causing the might of this heavenly unique flame to be completely unleashed. It wrapped around the pitch-black ghost face head in his hand and burned it wildly. The heavenly fire Tao Will was integrated into the purple world-destroying fire, causing its power to skyrocket. As it burned madly, the ghost face seemed to be wailing. It seemed to be begging for mercy and threatening Chen Zong. However, Chen Zong ignored it. He continued to activate it, wanting to destroy it. Chen Zong wasn't a compassionate person, nor was he a saint. He just felt that this item was too evil. If it fell into the hands of others, it was hard to guarantee that there wouldn't be unnecessary killings and incidents. He was very unhappy. Since that was the case, then he would destroy it to prevent future troubles. The ghost face was very tenacious, but it still couldn't resist the terrifying power of the purple world-destroying fire. Little by little, the black aura constantly drilled out and was burned into nothingness by the fire. After about a moment, there wasn't a trace of the black aura lingering in the air. The entire ghost face was burned red, like a red-hot soldering iron. The mixed iron refining hand, a tyrannical attack that gathered all the strength in his body and even erupted with the power of Lingwu, directly hit the ghost face. Crack! A fine and clear sound rang out. Soon after, numerous cracks appeared on the ghost face. They swiftly spread, covering the entire surface of the ghost face like a spiderweb. Shatter! The entire ghost face skull was shattered into countless pieces by Chen Zong's tyrannical attack. It was shattered even more thoroughly by the second attack of the mixed iron refining hand. The third attack of the mixed iron refining hand. The entire ghost face skull was completely shattered, turning into countless pieces of powder. With a shake of Chen Zong's hand, the will of the heavenly wind filled the air. Immediately, the powder flew away, scattering between heaven and earth. There was no possibility of it gathering again. It wasn't that Chunzong was too cautious, but Chunzong felt that this thing was very evil. It was better to be careful in order to avoid any trouble. As for the content of the 10,000 Ghosts scripture, except for the natal sacred weapon that was more outstanding, the other parts were more ordinary. It could be said that the true essence of the 10,000 Ghosts scripture was the nurturing of the natal sacred weapon of 10,000 Ghost. The other cultivation methods and secret skills were all born around this natal sacred weapon of 10,000 Ghost. In this way, it was not very useful to Chunzong, unless he could comprehend other methods to nurture the natal sacred weapon from it. However, Chunzong also knew that it was very, very difficult. However, since there was such a strange cultivation method as the 10,000 Ghosts scripture, then, could there be other similar cultivation methods or secret skills that could nurture the natal sacred weapon without being so evil? For a moment, Chunzong's mind was active. Although the sunken night sword was good, there would be a day when it couldn't keep up with him. At that time, he would inevitably have to change to other swords. Chapter 1632. Sixth sister-in-law is back with the baby. There might be some activity on the public account. Please pay attention to 6 Paths of Oblivion. The news spread like a storm and also like lightning. Not long after, Jiandi Chunzong's incident at the 10,000 Cracks sword scar spread like wildfire. Through push hands, it swept across the upper primordial realm like a strong storm. Jiandi. The meaning of this title was incomparably shocking. The King of Swords. The King of Swords. In the sky, an extremely dazzling ray of light streaked across the sky with the sharpness of a sword. Its speed was extremely shocking, leaving a dazzling light mark in the sky that did not dissipate for a long time. Jiandi, the King of Swords, let me, the Black Light Sword King, test your ability. The sword light flew in the direction of the 10,000 Cracks mountain, leaving behind only a distant voice in the sky. In the upper primordial realm, there was a river that was like an ocean. It was called the Upper Primordial River, and it ran from the north to the south. The river was endless, and the waves were surging. The widest part of the river was at least 10,000 miles long, and the narrowest part was still hundreds of miles long. This part of the river was thousands of miles wide, and the river was rapid and extremely violent. Waves that were dozens of meters long surged and surged endlessly. It had an astonishing aura that could shatter mountains. A light blue figure, surrounded by a wave-like blue halo, stood in the midst of the violent waves. As the violent waves surged, they surged in all directions, but they did not seem to be affected at all. Immediately, an aura spread out from the body of the light blue figure like a light blue ripple, sweeping in all directions. When the light blue ripple spread out, the violent waves seemed to be smoothed out by a pair of invisible hands. They became stable, peaceful, and comfortable. Within a few thousand meters, it was calm and peaceful. Beyond that, the waves were surging violently. These few thousand meters seemed to have become a domain that was inviolable. Immediately, the light blue-robed figure slowly unsheathed the longsword at his waist. The aqua-blue sword light was gentle but bright, and it was somewhat dazzling. It shone in all directions and slowly rose up. Endless water vapor also rose and spread, gathering within the longsword that was rippling with water light. The ripples overflowed as if there were endless ripples. Chop! With a swing of the sword, the boundless ripples became intense and spread out in an instant, breaking the peace within a radius of several thousand meters. It was as if the earth had been shattered and the sky had been shattered. An extremely terrifying sword light swept out in an instant, covering a radius of 1,000 meters. The astonishing power seemed to want to destroy everything. Within 1,000 meters, the waves surged violently, as if they were going to destroy everything. They rolled up dozens of meters high and over 100 meters high, covering the sky and the earth, turning into a dark blue inverted bowl. Subsequently, a dazzling azure light split open from the middle and shot out. It was as if a dragon had emerged from the sea and split the river into two. It cleaved apart countless waves and advanced courageously. This section of the water seemed to have been split open. It was tens of meters deep and stretched for tens of thousands of meters. It was extremely shocking. The giant wave crashed down, and the world-shaking momentum swept out in all directions, covering everything. The sword scar that stretched for over 10,000 meters also healed. Everything returned to normal. Immediately, a figure in a light blue robe soared into the sky, as if he was going to break the heavens. His body carried a vast and astonishing momentum, surging violently as he quickly flew in the direction of the 10,000 splits sword scar. Jiandi Chenzong. A light blue light streaked across the sky at an astonishing speed. As he spoke, he said in a low voice, "If that old guy knows about this, he will definitely rush over. When that time comes, he will be defeated by my sword." This person was the Dragon Wave Sword King, who was ranked second on the Upper Yuan Sky Sword list. As for the old guy he mentioned, he was the top swordsman on the Upper Yuan Sky Sword list. At the same time, he was also a super expert who was ranked second on the Upper Yuan Sky Sword list. He was extremely powerful, and the power of his swordsmanship was astonishing. He knew that old guy very well. Unless he was in seclusion, if he heard about Jiandi Chernzong, he would definitely rush over. In the Upper Yuan realm, there was a mountain. The mountain towered into the sky, and the earth rose into the sky. It was lofty and steep, like an ancient giant sword, emitting an astonishing vigor and sharpness. The mountain rocks stood towering on the mountain, and their shapes were like swords that pointed straight up into the sky. The plants were sparse, yet every single one of them was extremely tough and tenacious, and they were faintly suffused with traces of sharp fluctuations that seemed like sword chi intended to tear everything apart. The entire mountain seemed to emit traces of sword chi. Mountain rocks, vegetation, gravel, sword chi enveloped the mountain. This mountain was famous in the Upper Yuan realm. It was called Sky Sword. Sky Sword Mountain. A long time ago it was an orthodoxy. However, this orthodoxy was quite unique. In every generation, there would only be one sect master and one disciple. There would only be two in total, and there would never be a third. In the ancient war, Sky Sword Mountain's half-step Supreme Saint sect master and his disciple, who was in the Mastery Saint Rudiment realm, fought against the Void Demons. They killed countless Void Demons, but they were not spared. In the end, they perished, causing the Sky Sword Mountain's legacy to be severed. However, Sky Sword Mountain's legacy was passed down from generation to generation. Every generation was a Sword Dao powerhouse, and every generation had talent in Sword Dao. After cultivating for a long time, their sword intent constantly affected everything in the mountain. After countless years, everything in the mountain was filled with sword chi. After the ancient war, there was a person who had nowhere else to go. He coincidentally entered Sky Sword Mountain and obtained the legacy left behind in the mountain. He became the new sect master of Sky Sword Mountain, causing the Sky Sword Mountain's orthodoxy to be passed down again. Many years had passed since the ancient war. Sky Sword Mountain had regained some of its former glory, but it was still quite far from what it was after the ancient war. After all, Sky Sword Mountain's orthodoxy in the ancient era was complete. It could produce half-step Supreme Saint powerhouses, and even Supreme Saint powerhouses. After the ancient war, Sky Sword Mountain's orthodoxy became incomplete, and it was difficult to cultivate to half-step Supreme Saint. Every generation's sect master of Sky Sword Mountain had a title, Tianjianzi. There were no palaces on Sky Sword Mountain's peak, only two thatched huts. In front of one of the thatched huts, there was a cliff facing the sea of clouds. On the cliff, there was a white-robed old man with his hands behind his back. His body was as straight as a sword, and his entire body was filled with a shocking sword aura as if it could break through the 9 heavens. "Master, it's time to go." Behind the white-robed old man, a young man bowed and asked respectfully. This young man was also dressed in a white robe. His eyebrows were like swords, and his eyes were bright. They contained a shocking sharpness, like the edge of a sword. His entire body exuded an extremely shocking sharpness, like an unsheathed heavenly sword that could cut through everything in the world. It was difficult to look at him directly. "Let's go." The old man only said one word. It was plain, but it contained an inexplicable power, as if it could tear through the void. As soon as his voice fell, a sword light spread out from under the feet of the current Tian Jianzi. It lifted his feet, and he flew away at an astonishing speed. A sword light also spread out from under the feet of the young man. It lifted his feet and body, and he flew out at an astonishing speed, closely following his master. 10,000 splits sword scar. Chen Zong stood 3,000 meters away from the end of the scar. He cleared all distracting thoughts and focused on comprehending. In the distance, many people were watching. The number of people was several times more than before. They all rushed over after hearing the news. Jiandi. This title had a great meaning, and many people yearned for it. Some were curious about what this Jiandi looked like, while others admired it and wanted to pay their respects. All in all, everyone had their own reasons and rushed over from all directions. Those who were closer had already arrived, while those who were farther away were still on their way. 3,000 meters. This is the record of the Profound Radiance Sword King. As expected of the Jiandi. He's so young, but so amazing. In terms of age, Chen Zong was indeed several times younger than the Profound Radiance Sword King. 3,000 meters was the Profound Radiance Sword King's record a few years ago. Now that a few years have passed, the Profound Radiance Sword King will only become stronger. There were also people who didn't like the Profound Radiance Sword King and supported him. Don't forget that the Profound Radiance Sword King is ranked 3rd on the Shangyuan Sky Sword ranking. Above him are the Dragon Wave Sword King and the Tianjianzi. They haven't been to the 10,000 splits sword scar for many years. If they try, they can definitely reach 3,000 meters or even 1,000 meters. Although the Jiandi killed the 1,000 Ghost Sword King, the 1,000 Ghost Sword King was ranked 4th on the Sky Sword ranking. It's still unknown if he can compare with the Profound Radiance Sword King and the other two. The discussion continued. Some people thought highly of the Jiandi Chen Zong, but others didn't. They thought that the top 3 on the Shangyuan Sky Sword ranking were stronger. The countless discussions didn't affect Chen Zong in the slightest. Chen Zong was completely immersed in it and couldn't extricate himself. The closer he got to the 10,000 splits sword scar, the clearer the mysteries were, and the better the effect of comprehending it. At this moment, an extremely dazzling sword light flew in from outside the 10,000 splits sword scar. Its speed was indescribable, and it landed in an instant. It flew past everyone's eyes, leaving a trace of brilliance in their eyes. In the blink of an eye, the light swept into the 10,000 meters range without any pause. Soon, it broke through 1,000 meters after another. Its momentum was astonishing. 5,000 meters. Who is that? Only then did everyone realize. The mystic light is blazing. It's dazzling but not blinding. It's mysterious. It's the Mystic Light Sword King. The Mystic Light Sword King is here. All of a sudden, everyone was extremely excited. The 99 on the Shangyuan Sky Sword ranking represented the 99 sword experts in the Upper Yuan realm. Being ranked in the top 3 had an extraordinary meaning. For hundreds of years, the top 3 on the Heavenly Sword ranking had not changed. Those 3 experts had long been deeply ingrained in people's hearts. However, it was rare to see them on a normal day. I was right to come. The Mystic Light Sword King is really here. Some people were extremely excited, as if they had seen someone they had admired for a long time. That kind of excitement was indescribable. Since the Mystic Light Sword King is here, what about the Dragon Wave Sword King? Will he also come? Some people secretly guessed. The more they thought about it, the more excited they became. If the Dragon Wave Sword King is also here, then what about Tianjianzi? It would be wonderful to see the Mystic Light Sword King, the Dragon Wave Sword King, and Tianjianzi at the same time. The more they thought about it, the more excited they became. Soon, the dazzling light crossed 4,000 meters. Its speed also dropped in an instant, but it was still approaching. Chapter 1633. The 10,000 cracks sword scars had endless sword chi, and it was as cold as hell. A figure that was emitting a bright but not dazzling light appeared in front of Zhong Chun. It was as if he was a deity that had descended to the world, and he exuded an indescribable aura. That pair of glowing eyes stared straight at Chen Zong, as if wanting to see through him and see through all his secrets. Facing this person's gaze, Chen Zong felt a slight pressure that seemed to come from the deepest part of his heart. "Why don't you greet your sword, senior?" The figure in the profound light spoke. His voice seemed to be vast and mighty like light, shaking the surroundings and pressing down. "As the sword emperor of this generation, do you not know etiquette?" Chen Zong immediately understood that the other party did not come with good intentions. Although he did not draw his sword, his words were as sharp as the edge of a sword. "If we're talking about age, the elder is the king." "There is no need for the king naming tower," Chen Zong retorted calmly. Age was never the standard for sword training. It didn't mean that one would be stronger just because they were older. If one were to judge them based on their age, how could those rising stars have any place to stand out? Chen Zong was implying that the other party was taking advantage of his seniority. "Young man, your words are sharp, but I wonder if your sword is the same," the profound light sword king said again, not angry at all. "You can try." Chen Zong's tone was still flat. It sounded so calm, but there was an indescribable sharpness in it. No matter how sharp the words of a swordsman were, no matter how many words he said, in the end, it all depended on the real sword in his hand to determine victory and defeat. Everything else was meaningless. Suddenly, everyone in the distance became excited. The profound light sword king was going to fight the real Jiandi sword. "Young man, you can draw your sword first," the profound light sword king said coldly. His tone was arrogant. Up until now, he was still relying on the fact that he was older than Chen Zong and had started practicing earlier. He wanted to be the senior of Chen Zong and suppress him with his power. In a 2-on-1 fight, power was very important. If one had the upper hand, he might have the upper hand. "Are you looking for an excuse for your impending defeat?" Chen Zong said unhurriedly with a cold smile. "If so, I'll give it to you." As soon as he finished speaking, he did not give the other party a chance to retort. The deep night sword was instantly unsheathed, bringing with it a wisp of darkness as it pierced through the sky. When the sword light appeared, it was like a dark meteor, descending with unparalleled intent. The Sword King's eyelids twitched uncontrollably as he felt a strong sense of threat. It was fine if he didn't draw his sword, but once he did, it was so sharp. The profound Light Sword King already knew that Chen Zong had killed the Thousand Ghost Sword King, but the Thousand Ghost Sword King had fought the profound Light Sword King before. Although the latter was strong, there was still a gap between them. Although many years had passed and the myriad ghost sword monarch's strength had grown, Li Qia's own improvement was also very obvious. The profound Light Sword King did not know that when Chen Zong killed the Thousand Ghost Sword King, he had used all the power of the Thousand Ghost Sword and paid a huge price. His strength was terrifying. Li Qia unsheathed his sword and the dazzling sword light suddenly lit up. It was like an aurora streaking across the sky, leaving behind a dazzling sword mark. The dazzling sword light seemed to disperse all the darkness in an instant, but it could not disperse Chen Zong's sword attack. light and darkness. It was like two extreme powers colliding. As the two swords clashed, Chen Zong immediately felt an extremely tyrannical power burst forth. The astonishing power that was filled with light instantly assaulted him through the swords. He felt as if he was being assimilated by the power of the sword. Was this the power of the profound light sword king? Was this his sword intent? This thought flashed through Li Qia's mind. This kind of power was indeed shocking, but it still could not do anything to him. The profound light sword king was also shocked. No wonder he was the current Jiandi recognized by the king-naming tower. He was indeed very strong. But so what? A junior was a junior. He had to act like one. Li Qia unsheathed his sword. Countless sword lights became dazzling and extremely dazzling. It was like a bright sun shining countless rays of light in all directions. It seemed to be able to disperse all the coldness, darkness, and matter. In the distance, people could only squint their eyes. They could barely see a blur. The light was not dazzling at first, but now it was extremely dazzling. Chen Zong's entire body was covered by the intense light. It was as if he was being devoured. That light was too pure and too dazzling. It could not tolerate anything else. However, a trace of extreme darkness instantly cut through the intense light. It seemed to be eternal as it pierced through the sky. Chen Zong realized that the profound light sword king's swordsmanship was very profound. Every sword move was magnificent and filled with shocking technique. Swordsmanship was not as simple as it could be, or as magnificent as it could be. As the saying went, the great Tao is the simplest. However, some people would pursue the ultimate magnificence. They would perform magnificence to the extreme. Whether it was simple or magnificent, it was a kind of Tao. The Tao was indescribable and mysterious. The profound light sword king's swordsmanship had reached the pinnacle in terms of technique. Every sword move was not only magnificent, but also contained shocking light. It was extremely dazzling. Coupled with the magnificent swordsmanship, it was hard to predict and defend against. However, no matter how magnificent the profound light sword king's swordsmanship was, no matter how complicated his techniques were, no matter how dazzling the sword lights were, it could not break through Chen Zong's defense. The unbreakable sword king had always mastered the unbreakable sword ring. Furthermore, it was even more profound. Coupled with the heart domain, it was even more unbreakable. The unbreakable sword ring was most suitable to deal with a group of people or attacks with many different techniques. If one wanted to break through the unbreakable sword ring, unless one's technique had reached an unimaginable height or one's power was much stronger than the unbreakable sword ring. Otherwise, it was impossible to break through the unbreakable sword ring's defense. Unfortunately, the unbreakable sword ring was only suitable for defense. After attacking for a while, the unbreakable sword king was still unable to break through the unbreakable sword ring's defense. This made the profound light sword king even more shocked. However, he had practiced swordsmanship for many years. His attainments in swordsmanship were unfathomable. His temperament was also very steady. He would not become impatient because of this. He had practiced swordsmanship for many years. He had encountered all kinds of opponents and faced many difficulties. However, he had always relied on his own ability and one sword move to kill his way out. It was the same now. It would be the same. Since he could not break through the unbreakable sword ring's defense with only one sword move, then he would have a taste of the power of his profound light sword technique. With this thought, the sword chi was generated. The profound light sword essence was activated to the extreme. Tens of thousands of rays of light burst out in an instant, filling the surroundings in an instant. It was as if plowing through a courtyard and sweeping through acupoints. The people in the distance had to close their eyes, unable to look directly at it. The profound light sword king's sword light had always been easy to recognize. It was dazzling but not dazzling. However, although the sword light that burst out at this moment was not dazzling, it was extremely dazzling. It was also impossible to look directly at it. Chunzong's heart suddenly skipped a beat. He instinctively felt that this move was extraordinarily powerful. Profound light swift sword. It was as swift as light. It was extremely fast. The speed of the profound light sword essence was displayed to the extreme. The tens of thousands of rays of light were compressed into one in an instant. The moment the sword was released, it had already arrived. Chunzong's heart suddenly skipped a beat. An indescribable sense of danger spread out. Fast. This sword was really too fast. It was like an aurora that pierced through the heavens and the earth. It was extremely sharp. Too fast. It was indescribably fast. Without breaking the defense of the sword circle, it was impossible to defend against it. However, with the heart domain, Chunzong instantly caught a trace of it. Although this sword was extremely fast, Chunzong's heart domain was also very mysterious. The sword was immediately blocked. An extremely strong sharpness surged out. Astonishing rays of light splashed out like sparks. It was blocked. His sword had actually been blocked. The profound light sword king was extremely surprised. However, he did not hesitate in his attack. The sword light rose again and instantly broke through the air. Profound light swift sword. Profound light swift sword. Profound light swift sword. 3 consecutive sword strikes broke through the air. The speed of the sword was 30% faster than before. However, these 3 sword strikes were all blocked by Chunzong. They were unable to break through the defense of the sword circle. Vaguely, Chunzong seemed to have grasped something. His comprehension of the 24 dragons and snakes illustration deepened. Profound light. Sword storm. In a low roar, as if containing an unparalleled will, an extremely strong light burst out again. It was vast and endless. Every ray of light contained an extremely terrifying power. Endless dazzling rays of light surged and gathered from all directions. Like rivers flowing into the sea, they poured into the light, causing it to become even more intense. It was as if it could not be dispersed. A heart-palpitating power also spread out. Sword storm. A sword that contained extreme light and power. Its power was extremely tyrannical. As the sword struck out, an extremely terrifying and dazzling sword light blasted towards Chunzong. This sword was actually different from the style of the profound light sword king in the past. It seemed to have abandoned the gorgeous and varied techniques and turned into a pure oppression of power. Rumble. Like a thunderbolt, the sword light was extremely ferocious. Not only was it dazzling, but it was also like a violent thunderbolt that could destroy everything in the sky. The profound light sword king's profound light sword technique was created by himself. There were only 3 moves. The first move focused on the speed of the profound light sword intent. It was extremely fast. The second move was the opposite. It focused on the explosion of power. It was extremely terrifying to the extreme. Since the profound light sword's astonishing speed could not penetrate the opponent's defense, then it would destroy the opponent's defense with its strongest power. It had to be said that the profound light sword king's idea was very good. However, there were times when things did not go as planned. Chunzong's heart domain shrank. He did not change to other sword moves. He still used the unbreakable sword circle. This was not a sword move. It was just a defensive move that could adapt to the situation. However, Chunzong had a stroke of good fortune. He was able to slowly unravel the mysteries of the Infinity Sword Chain's unique skills, slowly integrating them into the unbreakable sword loop. Boom! The sword blasted out in a mighty manner. It was as if it had the power to move the heavens and earth. The moment it came into contact with the sunken knight sword, the terrifying power contained within was instantly released and exploded. It was like a torrent bursting through a dam, destroying everything in its path as easily as crushing dry weeds. Chapter 1634. The light was dazzling, and it was extremely violent. The terrifying power overflowed like a storm of meteors, destroying everything. Moreover, the power of the explosion was controlled by the profound Light Sword King, so none of it leaked out. It was all directed to the center, where Chen Zong was. The profound Light Sword King didn't care whether Chen Zong was dead or alive. If he was lucky enough to survive, he wouldn't kill him. However, if he was unlucky enough to die, he would only regret it. However, under the combination of the unbreakable sword ring and the chain sword, all the power was weakened layer by layer. In the end, it couldn't hurt Chen Zong at all. The profound Light Sword King's face became extremely solemn. To actually block his profound light sword explosion like this, it was truly somewhat inconceivable. His opponent's eyes were still as sharp as ever. They were as sharp as the heavenly sword, full of awe-inspiring might. The profound Light Sword King felt an indescribable throbbing. Strong. How could he be so strong? In Chen Zong's eyes, the profound Light Sword King and the Thousand Ghost Sword King's basic strength were not much different. Compared to the Thousand Ghost Sword King's full strength, the profound Light Sword King was obviously weaker. If that was all, the profound Light Sword King was no match for him at all. However, the profound Light Sword King's sword technique was indeed very good. Profound Light Sword King, if you don't have any more powerful moves, this will be your burial ground. Chen Zong's voice rang out slowly. It was flat, as if it did not contain any worldly aura, but it made the profound Light Sword King shiver in fright. His hair stood on end. He could sense an extremely sharp killing intent from the very depths of his heart from Chen Zong's plain voice. The profound Light Sword King didn't hold back at all. Although he didn't have much murderous intent, it was a fact that he didn't hold back at all. Chen Zonggan felt that it was clear. "Take another move from me," the profound Light Sword King suddenly shouted. He had already lost his composure. Then, an extremely bright light exploded from his body. It was like the blooming of the sun, shining in all directions. The profound Light Sword King seemed to have turned into a huge source of light. The originally dazzling light suddenly changed. It became extremely dazzling, as if it wanted to pierce through everyone's eyes. Even if they closed their eyes, they could still feel an extremely intense light rushing towards them. They had no choice but to turn their heads away, not daring to face it directly. Since they couldn't see, they could only use their divine sense. However, as soon as they spread their divine sense, they immediately felt endless light. Light Sword King, boundless Light Sword King. His divine perception was completely filled with extremely shocking light. It was too dazzling, too resplendent, and too intense. It truly filled the heavens and the earth and the surroundings, and it couldn't hold anything else. The profound Sword King was the Sword King. The profound Light Sword King King. The profound Sword King was. The profound Light Sword King he'd reached the extreme state. The moment he used this move, Chen Zong's heart suddenly jumped. His eyelids trembled slightly, and he felt a slight pain between his eyebrows. It was so mysterious. It was as if the light was everywhere. It made him feel like he couldn't resist it. The unbreakable sword ring couldn't block the light even if it was really unbreakable, because the light was everywhere. This move was really exquisite. If the myriad ghost sword monarch's forbidden technique was ignored, then the profound Light Sword Monarch's attack was indeed much stronger than the myriad ghost sword monarch's. However, it was still a bit weaker than the myriad ghost sword monarch's forbidden technique. However, Chen Zong realized that the unbreakable sword ring couldn't completely block this move. It could be said that the unbreakable sword ring was broken this time. What broke the unbreakable sword circle wasn't a power so strong that it couldn't be resisted, nor was it a technique so brilliant that it couldn't be dealt with. It was the third kind, which covered everything in all directions and filled every inch of the void. There was truly nowhere to hide. Although this move broke the unbreakable sword ring, it also let Chen Zong know the flaw of the unbreakable sword ring. Unbreakable golden body. The profound light sword king lived up to his name. The power of this move was indeed irresistible. Then, let's take it head-on. Chen Zong immediately pushed the non-quenching jade technique to the extreme. He ignited the Lingwu power and turned it into Chaos Heaven power. In an instant, the Chaos Heaven power, which was originally mid-stage Chaos Heaven power, soared to mid-stage Chaos Heaven power. The unbreakable golden body's shocking power was also raised. It became even more powerful. The golden light was branded on his body like a flame, giving off an indestructible feeling. Of course, it was still a long way from being truly unbreakable, indestructible. However, it was beginning to take shape. With such a strong physique and unbreakable golden body defense, Chen Zong immediately blocked the profound light sword king's mysterious sword attack. The omnipresent light seemed to transform into an omnipresent sword light. It tried to tear Chen Zong's body into pieces, but it was completely blocked. It couldn't hurt him at all. As Chen Zong blocked this attack, he carefully comprehended the mysteries contained within. This sword has mysteries. It should be used by me. It will be the cornerstone for me to reach the pinnacle of sword Dao. Chen Zong would never be jealous of someone whose swordsmanship was more profound and exquisite than his own. He would only feel happy and fight with them to absorb the profundity and essence of the opponent's swordsmanship to improve and strengthen himself. In a great era, there would be geniuses, prodigies, and even monsters in every generation. Some would die prematurely, but some would grow up. As long as one had the heart, strength, and willpower, they would be more or less outstanding. They would be sincere in their life, and would always be outstanding in some aspect. For example, the profound light sword king was able to create such a brilliant third move of the profound light sword technique. It was unstoppable and all-pervasive. It was truly shocking. Unfortunately, although this move was very mysterious, it wasn't as powerful as the profound light sword explosion. Otherwise, Chen Zong wouldn't have been able to block it so easily. Of course, if Chen Zong didn't have such a strong body refinement realm cultivation, Lingwu power, and unbreakable golden body, he would have been injured. However, there were no ifs. When the light dissipated, everyone looked again. They saw the profound light sword king's lifeless face. Jiandi Chen Zong also seemed to be unharmed, except for the many small holes in his robe. What happened just now? Apart from the profound light sword king and Chen Zong, no one else knew because they couldn't see. Even their divine sense was filled with endless light. However, when they saw the profound light sword king's lifeless face, everyone was shocked. "Is this all you've got?" Chen Zong asked calmly. The profound light sword king's hair stood on end. Without hesitation, he immediately used the last of his strength and secret escape technique. The profound light sword king's body seemed to have disappeared. He directly turned into a ray of light and rushed toward the 10,000 cracks sword scar at the fastest speed possible. Even his most powerful move couldn't do anything to the other party. He couldn't even break through the other party's defense. How could he fight? Of course, he could use even more powerful moves, but the price was too high. He wasn't confident. If he continued to stay, would he be waiting for death? The profound light sword king was no fool. He could see that the other party was ready to kill him. If he didn't leave now, when would he? The profound light sword king's reaction was extremely fast. However, this time, Chen Zong didn't have any intention of letting him go. In an instant, he turned into a gust of wind and rushed out like a gust of wind. He used the sky wind formless movement technique to the extreme. Although he wasn't as fast as the profound light sword king, the other party was using a secret art that consumed his body. He wouldn't be able to last long. Everyone could only watch the profound light sword king turn into a ray of light and escape. Seeing Jiandi Chun Zong turn into a gust of wind and chase after the profound light sword king, they were all stunned. Then, they all soared into the sky and rushed over. They wanted to see how it would turn out. Would the profound light sword king escape? Or would Jiandi Chun Zong catch up and kill him? No one could stop it. The profound light sword king's escape technique was indeed very fast. However, it was still a secret art that consumed his body. It was explosive. Once the explosive period passed, he would return to his original speed. Moreover, if he was injured, his speed would also be affected, making him slower than usual. It would be fine if Chun Zong didn't chase after him. However, Chun Zong didn't give up. As soon as the profound light sword king slowed down, Chun Zong immediately caught up. The profound radiance sword king's face, which was already pale, turned even paler. Fear. Fear came from the bottom of his heart. How many years had it been since he was in such a sorry state? Even in the deepest part of his heart, the profound light sword king felt a trace of regret. If he had known that this person was so terrifying and cruel, he wouldn't have stuck his neck out. He wouldn't have fallen to such a state. Chun Zong closed in. His body was like a gust of wind, emitting an extremely cold, killing intent. He held his sword and attacked. The profound light sword king knew that he was in danger. He might die here. As such, he had no choice but to use some desperate methods. Even if his foundation was damaged, he didn't care. After all, as long as he could survive, there was still a chance for his foundation to recover. If he died, his hundreds of years of hard work would all be in vain. Chun Zong also sensed the profound radiance sword king's determination. His eyes became sharp, filled with the determination to fight for survival in the face of death. Since that's the case, I'll send you on your way with my strongest sword. Chun Zong was about to use the line of heaven and earth to kill the profound light sword king. Suddenly, a vast and mighty sword intent came from afar. Wait a moment! As the vast and majestic sword intent permeated the air, a voice surged forth along with the sword intent. It was as if there were layers upon layers of raging waves, as if the ocean was flowing. The waves surged endlessly, as if the Milky Way was passing through. The momentum was awe-inspiring. In an instant, Chun Zong felt like he was facing the mighty heaven and earth. It was as if a great river was rushing over from the distant horizon. Chapter 1635. White clouds drifted in the vast sky, and thousands of miles of it flowed like water. The momentum of the long river was like endless waves, as if a blue river was slowly rushing over from the distant horizon. Vaguely, there seemed to be the phantom of a flood dragon that was undulating and meandering in the long blue river, and it was suffused with an astonishing Taoist aura. The people chasing from afar also saw it and were shocked. It's the Dragon Wave Sword King. The Dragon Wave Sword King, second on the Heaven Sword list, is also here. Such an obvious symbol was very clear, causing everyone to exclaim in surprise. First, the profound radiance Sword King arrived, but was beaten back. Then, he fled and was almost killed. Fortunately, the Dragon Wave Sword King appeared, indirectly saving the profound radiance Sword King's life. The profound radiance Sword King also noticed the situation and immediately flew in the direction of the Dragon Wave Sword King. He had a good relationship with the Dragon Wave Sword King, and this time, he could use him to save his life. Save his life first. That tyrannical and majestic aura surged forth, causing Chun Zong to be on guard. Very strong. Stronger than the profound radiance Sword King, this was a strong opponent. While being cautious, Chun Zong was also excited and eager to fight. If the profound radiance Sword King was so strong, then what about this person? How strong was he? Chun Zong secretly guessed that this person should be ranked higher than the profound radiance Sword King, but he didn't know whether he was second or first on the Shangyuan Heaven Sword list. You already have the upper hand, why do you have to kill him? The Dragon Wave Sword King said. The Dragon Wave Sword King spoke again, his voice carrying a majestic aura that reverberated in all directions. It was as though he wanted to suppress Chen Zong with his aura. If you want to kill, you must be prepared to die, Chen Zong said slowly with a smile. If you want to save him, you must defeat me. Chen Zong's reply was simple and direct. There was no point in saying more. Everything would be decided by the sword. If you win, everything you say is reasonable. If you lose, everything you say is useless. As Chen Zong's words fell, the blue sky seemed to be enraged. Its aura became more and more shocking, and the shadow of the dragon seemed to become clearer. Meanwhile, 2 rays of sword light flew over from afar, and they were suffused with brilliant might and heavenly might. Interestingly, the vital energy of the 2 rays of sword light seemed to be connected, causing their speeds to be equal, and it was like a form of traction. As soon as these 2 rays of sword light appeared, they seemed to have drawn over the will of the heavens and the earth, and they emanated an indescribable pressure. The pressure was ghastly and sharp, and it faintly revealed a domineering aura. Tianjianzi. The profound light sword king swallowed a pill and recovered a little. He didn't look as bad as before, but when he saw the 2 sword lights, he was stunned. The Dragon Wave Sword Monarch was also slightly taken aback. Tianjianzi. It was Tianjianzi. Tianjianzi was ranked first on the Shangyuan Sky Sword list. He was very powerful, and in terms of age and strength, he was above the Profound Light Sword King and the Dragon Wave Sword King. In fact, both the Profound Light Sword King and the Dragon Wave Sword King had challenged Tianjianzi before, but the results made them realize that the gap between them and Tianjianzi was very obvious. It was worthy of being an orthodoxy passed down from ancient times. Even though it was lost in the ancient war, the parts that were preserved were still very profound and amazing. Tianjianzi had been immersed in it for many years, and had already grasped its essence. He was incomparable to others. The heaven list of the entire Upper Yuan realm was a list of the strongest experts below the half-step Great Saint level. Tianjianzi was ranked second, which was enough to show his terrifying strength. It should be known that the top 3 of each list were often very powerful, and were much stronger than those below them. Even the Dragon Wave Sword King, who was ranked second on the Shangyuan Sky Sword list, was ranked 4th on the Shangyuan Sky Sword list. The gap was not small. Of course, the sword practice in the Upper Yuan realm was very popular, and the strength of sword experts was also very strong. As soon as the 2 sword lights appeared, they stopped a few thousand meters away from Chen Zong. The terrifying sharpness locked onto Chen Zong from afar. Although one of them was not weak, it was not much, because compared to the Million Ghost Sword King, there was still a big gap. But the other sword did not feel as sharp. It was somewhat restrained, but in fact, it contained even more shocking and terrifying power. First on the Shangyuan Sky Sword list. In an instant, Chen Zong guessed the identity of the other party. The crowd in the distance exclaimed. Unlike the Profound Light Sword King and the Dragon Wave Sword King, Tianjianzi, who was ranked first on the Shangyuan Sky Sword list, had made a name for himself earlier. His battle record was not something the Profound Light Sword King and the Dragon Wave Sword King could compare with. Although in the later period, Tianjianzi became low-key and almost never left his house, the Profound Light Sword King and the Dragon Wave Sword Light had challenged him one after another, and had been defeated, which had caused quite a stir. In addition, Tianjianzi had taken in a disciple. After he grew up, he left the mountain with a sword and traveled the world with it. He challenged experts everywhere and made a name for himself. He was honored as Shao Tianjian and ranked 11th on the Shangyuan Sky Sword list. Whenever someone mentioned Shao Tianjian, it would be related to Tianjianzi, and his name would rise. Now, the young man beside Tianjianzi was Shao Tianjian. Jiandi Donglai, the sword cultivators of the Upper Yuan realm. It's an honor. Tian Jianzi was dressed in a white robe, and his beard was 3 feet long. He had a sage-like appearance. His face was ruddy and his eyes were clear. When he opened his mouth, he smiled and was very polite. His voice was powerful and clear, and it made people feel comfortable listening to it. Unknowingly and invisibly, the atmosphere of mutual hostility was quietly disintegrated. Chen Zong couldn't help but be secretly surprised. He was indeed the strongest swordsman on the Shangyuan Sky sword list. He hadn't drawn his sword, but when he opened his mouth, an invisible, indescribable, and undetectable power had already spread out. But Jiandi's actions this time are a bit too much. Tian Jianzi spoke again, but his voice was slightly deeper. His eyes flashed with a brilliant light, and an astonishing aura gradually spread out. The Upper Yuan realm welcomes fellow sword cultivators to exchange pointers and talk about the sword, but we don't like evil guests. In other words, Chen Zong was an evil guest. Why was Chen Zong an evil guest? It was nothing more than that Chen Zong had killed the Ghost Shadow, the Blood Sword King, and the Thousand Ghost Sword King, and almost killed the Profound Light Sword King, if the Dragon Wave Sword King hadn't arrived in time. But Chen Zong knew who was right and who was wrong, and Tian Jianzi probably also knew very well. However, from Tian Jianzi's point of view, he was a sword cultivator of the Upper Yuan realm, and also the number 1 on the Shangyuan Sky sword list. He was the representative and face of the sword cultivators of the Upper Yuan realm. Of course, he wouldn't stand on Chen Zong's side. In the end, it had nothing to do with right or wrong. It was just that their standpoints were different, but they still had to find a suitable reason. As the saying goes, stand on the moral high ground, gain the upper hand by a show of strength, suppress the opponent's momentum, and seize the opportunity. Whether it was the Profound Light Sword King, the Dragon Wave Sword King, or even Tian Jianzi, they were all like this. As soon as they opened their mouths, they had to put themselves on the moral high ground, put themselves in a position of initiative, and seize the opportunity to strike first. It had to be said that these sword cultivators who had lived for a longer time had more complicated thoughts. If they were careless, they might be influenced by their words, and fall into the trap of their words. They would be at a disadvantage, and their hands and feet would be tied. But for Chen Zong, it didn't affect him in the slightest. Chen Zong had a clear mind and had accumulated a lot of experience. His sword essence was the heart sword Dao Will, and it reflected his will. His mind was unmoved, and his soul was vigorous and strong. How could he be swayed by a few words? What's more, Chen Zong was the person involved, and he knew the cause and effect of the matter. Who could distort the facts? Whether you are an honored guest or an evil guest, you and I, as sword cultivators, will decide who is better with the sword in the end. Chen Zong laughed loudly, and there was an indescribable sense of pride and indescribable sharpness in his voice. His eyes emitted an extremely sharp divine brilliance, which shone directly into the void. An astonishingly tyrannical aura, which seemed to be able to split the sky and earth, also spread out, as if a divine sword was about to split the sky. Chen Zong had fought the Million Ghost Sword King to the death, and then the Profound Light Sword King to the death. After that, he was suppressed by the aura of the Dragon Wave Sword King and Tian Jianzi, which made Chen Zong's aura more condensed. It came from the heart and manifested in the sword. If the heart was strong, the sword would be strong. My sword is here. Who wants to fight? 8 words suddenly came out of Chen Zong's mouth. The fingers of his left hand brushed across the body of the deep night sword, and with a light flick, the long sword hummed, and the edge of the sword was peerless. White clothes and a black sword, high-spirited, sharp as the sky, and disdainful eyes, like a peerless picture scroll, instantly appeared in front of everyone's eyes. It was like a brand which was unforgettable. Only when they recalled it in the future, they couldn't help but be amazed. They would even subconsciously mention it when they talked about some things in the world of cultivation with others, and even their own juniors, so that this reputation would be passed down forever. Tian Jianzi's eyes darkened slightly. He could see that the general momentum of his opponent had quietly condensed. This was amazing. Since ancient times, anyone who could condense the general momentum would be invincible, especially sword cultivators, who were more direct and thorough. When faced with such a person who had just formed the embryonic form of the general momentum, there were usually 3 ways to deal with it. The first way was to ignore it, which meant that it had nothing to do with it. But now that he was facing his opponent directly, he couldn't ignore it. He could only give up on this way. The second method was to take advantage of the fact that his momentum was still in its embryonic stage and had yet to truly condense to crush him and cause him to die prematurely. Even though it was slightly regretful that this world had lost such a peerless monster, if he was an enemy, then one had to use such a thunderous method to crush him. The third way was to admit defeat, avoid the sharpness, and no longer be an enemy. The third way was undoubtedly to admit that he was completely inferior to his opponent. It was like this today, and it would be like this in the future. For a moment, Tian Jianzi's thoughts were myriad. Although he looked very old and looked like an old man, his qi and blood were vigorous, and the speed of his thinking was as fast as lightning. In just a short moment, many thoughts had flashed through his mind, and he had made a decision. A swordsman could be modest, gentle, and low-key on the surface, but in the depths of his heart, there must be a sharpness that belonged to the sword. Otherwise, it would be a waste to practice the sword, and it would be better to give up the sword and return to the field to be an old farmer. Tian Jianzi was the strongest swordsman on the Upper Yuan Sky sword list, and he was the representative of the swordsman in the Upper Yuan realm. The sharpness in his heart was naturally very astonishing. Chapter 1636. Little Sixth Dao is on vacation and causing trouble all day. Sixth Dao is in deep trouble writing. Sixth sister-in-law can only take care of Berwazi and has no time to manage the public account. Thousands of meters up in the sky, the heavenly wind was sometimes strong and sometimes gentle. White clouds drifted, gathering and dispersing. Gazes were fixed on the scene from afar. The profound light Sword King, the Dragon Wave Sword King, and Tian Jianzi. What attitude would they adopt to face the Jiandi from the Xianyuan realm? What Chen Zong yearned for the most was a battle. Especially Tian Jianzi, who was the best swordsman below the half-step great saint level in the upper primordial realm. Even many half-step great saints who practiced swordsmanship admitted that they were inferior to Tian Jianzi in terms of swordsmanship. Since he was here, how could he miss out on such a powerful swordsman? Excited at the sight of a hunter, his gaze became sharper and sharper. Immediately, Tian Jianzi let out a long laugh. His momentum was as mighty as the edge of a sword. You are so young, but you have been recognized by the king naming pagoda and given a title to Jiandi. This shows that you have extraordinary talent and attainments in swordsmanship. Tian Jianzi made his decision. His gaze became sharper, as if it could pierce through thousands of meters of the sky. It pierced Chernzong like an invisible sword. I am not talented, but I think I have great attainments in swordsmanship. I like to duel with swordsmanship geniuses. Now that Jiandi has come from the east and is right in front of me, I am very happy. I wonder if Jiandi can fulfill this small wish of mine. He seemed to be asking a question, but his shocking sharpness was oppressing Chernzong. What he meant was that he would have to fight regardless of whether the other party agreed or not. Wait a moment. The Dragon Wave Sword King suddenly spoke. He smiled at Tian Jianzi and looked at Chernzong. His eyes faintly reflected the image of rivers and rivers. He gazed at Chernzong and a majestic aura spread. Tian Jianzi, everything is first come, first serve. This boy will be defeated by my sword. Tian Jianzi smiled. He had no intention of snatching it. He knew what the Dragon Wave Sword King was capable of. Although he wasn't as strong as him, he wasn't weak at all. Perhaps the Dragon Wave Sword Monarch would be able to deal with this kid and shatter his embryonic momentum. Whether it was the Dragon Wave Sword King or Tianjianzi, it didn't matter to Chunzong. If he defeated one, there would be another. I have a suggestion, but I'm not sure if Jiendi is willing to accept it. The Dragon Wave Sword Monarch smiled. His aura became even more vigorous and unfathomable. You and I are both sword cultivators. We have studied the sword for many years. Regardless of physique, cultivation, or Dao intent, we will compete with our sword skills. The Dragon Wave Sword Monarch had already learned from the Profound Radiance Sword Monarch that Chun Zongyo had a tyrannical body refinement cultivation. His defense was incomparably shocking, and even the third move of the Profound Radiance Sword Art couldn't break through it. The Dragon Wave Sword King was very clear about the power of the Profound Radiance Sword King. He also knew that he didn't have an absolute advantage over the Profound Radiance Sword King. He was only slightly stronger. Under such circumstances, it would be difficult, almost impossible, to defeat this person with the title of Jiendi. Therefore, he had to find another way. Regardless of cultivation, physique, or Dao insight, they only fought with sword techniques, and the victor would be decided with a single competition. The Dragon Wave Sword King was very confident in his own sword skills. Moreover, he was many times older than Chunzong. He had also been immersed in sword skills for many times longer than Chunzong. He was confident that he would surpass Chunzong in terms of sword skills. It had to be said that the Dragon Wave Sword King's thoughts flashed. He thought of many ideas and made the most advantageous choice. However, he made this choice based on the Profound Radiance Sword King's description. If he knew the details of the battle between Chunzong and the Myriad Ghost Sword King, he might not be so certain. Regardless of cultivation, physique, or Dao intent, we will compete with sword skills. All right, Chunzong agreed readily. He had experienced such battles many times. He wasn't afraid. Moreover, if he disregarded everything else and competed with sword skills, he would be able to see the profound mysteries of sword skills more clearly. He would be able to understand its essence and improve further. Chunzong's straightforward agreement made the Dragon Wave Sword King's heart sink. He had a bad feeling. However, he didn't think too much about it at this moment. Moreover, the Dragon Wave Sword King was very certain that he had practiced sword skills for many times longer than Chunzong. Even if Chunzong was more talented in sword skills, he couldn't make up for the difference in time. Moreover, his talent wasn't bad either. Jiendi Donglai would be defeated by his sword. Thinking of this, the Dragon Wave Sword King was even more confident. Not using cultivation to fight didn't mean that he couldn't use cultivation to fly. In fact, at the level of Chunzong and the Dragon Wave Sword King, they could easily fly by using a little bit of cultivation. In the void, the Dragon Wave Sword King's figure flashed. An astonishing aura spread out. It was as if he had brought up heavy waves that turned into a mighty river. The sword was unsheathed, bringing up layers of torrents. The faint roar of a dragon resounded in all directions. It was extremely intimidating. He didn't utilize his cultivation or Dao insight, and he merely utilized the profundities of his sword technique to draw upon the vital energy in the surroundings to create a type of phenomenon. This was something that only a person that had cultivated his sword technique to an extremely profound state was capable of executing. Everyone in the distance was shocked. Just one sword was enough to bring up the phenomenon of a dragon emerging from the water. It was indeed astonishing. The Dragon Wave Sword King's sword skills have improved a lot. Tian Jianzi nodded. Xiao Tianjian's eyes flashed with a hint of battle intent. In the regal world, he had detonated the seven-colored heavenly flower. His talent was greater than that of the mysterious Light Sword King and the Dragon Wave Sword King. Chen Zong stood in the void, waiting for the Dragon Wave Sword King to arrive. The surging river water gushed towards Chen Zong like a torrential current, directly hitting his body. This caused Chen Zong to feel traces of coldness from the water. Within the water, there were traces of astonishing sharpness. It was as if the river water was not illusory, but was condensed from strands of sword qi. The sunken knight's sword was unsheathed and slashed across. It looked simple and ordinary, but there was an indescribable charm that quietly permeated the air. The black sword mark seemed to permeate between heaven and earth, filling up the void and all things. However, it also gave people a feeling that its trajectory and aura were difficult to determine. It seemed to be there, but also seemed to be there. It seemed to be extremely strong, but also extremely gentle. Tian Jianzi had been immersed in the way of the sword for many years. His talent was outstanding, and his attainments in the way of the sword were extremely profound. He was very experienced. Therefore, Chen Zong only had to slowly unsheath his sword to see some clues. The Dragon Wave Sword King's sword skills were mighty and had an astonishing aura. It seemed to be very high-end and brilliant. It was extremely shocking. On the other hand, Chen Zong's sword skills looked ordinary. However, only a true expert in the way of the sword could see that Chen Zong's sword skills were extraordinary. It was a state of returning to one's natural state. It wasn't that the phenomenon didn't exist, but it wasn't obvious. It was contained within the sword, making it even more mysterious. Of course, the phenomenon of the sword skills was closely related to the sword skills. The Dragon Wave Sword King's sword skills were derived from water. It was like the flow of a river or a flood dragon playing with water. Naturally, the phenomenon of a flood dragon emerging from the water would appear. Chen Zong's sword skills came from the heart and were even more unpredictable. With a slash of his sword, he destroyed the river water that the Dragon Wave Sword King had sent over and blocked the flood dragon's ferocious attack. The Dragon Wave Sword King wasn't surprised that his sword was blocked. It would be strange if his opponent couldn't even block one of his attacks. The second slash. The third slash. The Dragon Wave Sword Monarch immediately unleashed his sword technique. Sword after sword after sword, connected with each other. There was a kind of profound ripple that rippled like the surging waves of a river. Layers of blue sword light came from all directions. Vaguely, one could even see a blue flood dragon baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. Unbreakable sword circle. Chen Zong didn't counterattack. Instead, he took a defensive stance. With a sword in hand, no matter how the Dragon Wave Sword King attacked, he was able to completely block them. None of the slashes could break through the defense of the sword circle and hurt Chen Zong. The profound radiance Sword King's sword technique was radiant, and his sword was very fast. Although the Dragon Wave Sword King's sword technique wasn't slow either, it was still slightly inferior. However, the most important thing wasn't the speed of the sword, but the unceasing flow of the sword like a river. It felt as if there was nothing it couldn't enter. Even so, Chen Zong blocked all of the attacks with a single slash of his sword. Chen Zong's body stood tall in the air, not moving at all. With a sword in his hand, regardless of whether it was the gurgling of water or the towering waves, he was as majestic as an immemorial divine mountain, everlasting and indestructible. The Dragon Wave Sword King heard from the profound radiance Sword King that Chen Zong's sword skills were astonishing, but he didn't expect it to be this shocking. It was simply unimaginable. If he couldn't break through the defense of his opponent's sword circle, he wouldn't be able to defeat his opponent. However, the Dragon Wave Sword King was more composed than the profound radiance Sword King. His mind was as calm as water in an ancient well, and the sword in his hand became faster. The sword's speed became faster, but it didn't disrupt his own rhythm. Instead, it became more ferocious and violent. It was as if the flowing water had turned into a torrent. His power increased greatly, and every slash became more terrifying. He wanted to use this to break Chunzong's unbreakable sword circle. Water vapor swept across the sky. When this phenomenon was pushed to the extreme, it gradually affected the water vapor in the surrounding air, causing it to fluctuate continuously. It was as if it had really turned into a swamp, and the Dragon Wave Sword King's sword skills became even more powerful. Gradually, the Dragon Wave Sword King's figure disappeared, and so did his sword. He seemed to have become one with his sword, turning into a ferocious flood dragon that stirred up havoc in the rivers and lakes. Sharp claws, swinging tail. Every attack burst forth with terrifying power, as if it was earth-shattering. Chunzong could clearly feel that the power of his opponent's sword skills had increased once again. However, his unbreakable sword circle had also improved after the battle with the Profound Radiance Sword King. He had integrated the essence of a chain of ultimate move. Once the sword circle was unleashed, layers of sword aura would continuously weaken his opponent's attacks, and finally block them. Chunzong also gained a lot of enlightenment from the Dragon Wave Sword King's sword skills. Dragon Snake Dance. In the distance, the Profound Radiance Sword King's expression was gloomy. It was this sword circle that had firmly blocked all of his attacks, causing them to fail. Chapter 1637. The void was vast and mighty, the long river was surging, and the flood dragon appeared, brandishing its claws and wagging its tail. Countless sword lights surged like flowing water and waves. Only the sword in his hand was like a towering wall. No matter how strong the wind and rain were, no matter how violent the waves were, he remained unmoved and unshaken. The Dragon Wave Sword Monarch had been continuously attacking with his sword for half an hour. He had displayed his swordsmanship to the extreme, even surpassing his previous level. However, he was still unable to break through Chunzong's defense and hurt Chunzong in the slightest. Although the Dragon Wave Sword Monarch had a calm temperament, he couldn't withstand the long period of inaction. Gradually, he became a little impatient. At the same time, the profundities and quintessence of his sword technique were repeatedly figured out clearly by Chunzong. His sword technique was like the surging waves of a long river, and it could be fast or slow, fierce or soft. Moreover, there were even WRMs hidden within it, and it possessed the profundities of the alternation of dragons and serpents, while yin and yang were hidden within it. Unknowingly, Chunzong was also verifying with the 24 dragon snake portrait. His understanding of the portrait deepened significantly in an instant. Vaguely, Chunzong felt that his understanding of the 24 dragon snake portrait seemed to have reached a peak, a bottleneck. As long as he broke through it, he would immediately reach a higher level and apply it to his swordsmanship, increasing its power again. It was a pity that the Dragon Wave Sword Monarch could only bring him this much improvement. He could only hope that the Tianjianzi could help him break through this limit. With this thought, Chunzong immediately launched a counterattack. First, it was a chain of sword strikes. The sword light was endless, layer upon layer. Vaguely, there seemed to be a trace of the profoundness of rivers and waves. There seemed to be the profoundness of the intersection of dragons and snakes. Although it was very faint and weak, it was beginning to take shape. The sudden counterattack caught the Dragon Wave Sword King off guard. After all, Chunzong had been on the defensive for a long time. The Dragon Wave Sword King had almost forgotten that his opponent was a human and could counterattack. This sword attack was extremely profound, instantly dispelling all of the Dragon Wave Sword Monarch's attacks into nothingness. Moreover, as the dragon and snake phantoms intersected, they secretly interpreted the profoundness of yin and yang, producing an invisible force. It was as if an invisible force had instantly stuck to the Dragon Wave Sword Monarch's sword, entangling it and pulling it toward the center. Even though this force was still very weak, it caught the Dragon Wave Sword King off guard in an instant. This pause meant that he had lost the initiative. Once the opportunity was lost, the consequences would be disastrous. A pitch-black sword light streaked across the sky. That chilling sharpness caused the Dragon Wave Sword Monarch's pupils to shrink. He wanted to dodge, but he was too slow. The tip of the sunken knight's sword was like a wisp of black star piercing through the void from afar. It lightly tapped the space between his eyebrows and pierced through, leaving only an undetectable mark. Then, it retreated and returned to its sheath. Everything happened so quickly that the Dragonwave Sword King didn't even have time to react before it ended. However, Tianjianzi had seen everything clearly, and he was even more shocked. What a brilliant sword technique! This level of attainment in sword technique was too terrifying. He was so young, yet he was able to surpass someone like the Dragon Wave Sword Monarch, who had been immersed in sword technique for many years. Was this the so-called talent of Jiandi? The Dragon Wave Sword Monarch touched the space between his eyebrows subconsciously. He knew that if it had been a life-and-death battle, his space between his eyebrows would have been pierced through, and he would have died an unnatural death. His expression kept changing, and in the end, he let out a sigh. "I've lost." The Dragon Wave Sword Monarch's voice was cryptic. He had to admit that he had lost, even though he was still somewhat unwilling. However, he was the one who suggested that regardless of cultivation level or Dao intent, they would only compete with sword technique. Now that he had lost, he was too ashamed to say that they would compete again with all their strength. Fortunately, there was still Tianjianzi. As long as Tianjianzi won, the reputation of the swordsman of the Upper Yuan realm would be preserved. It was just that he was unwilling. This time, Tianjianzi was going to steal the limelight again. "Master, I'll go and meet him," Xiao Tianjian said immediately. "Don't go," Tianjianzi said immediately. "You're still no match for him." Tianjianzi wasn't trying to discourage his disciple, but it was the truth. The gap between Xiao Tianjian and Chenzong was still very obvious. It seemed that this battle could only be ended by him. If he lost, then the reputation and glory of the swordsman of the Upper Yuan realm would be gone. It would be equivalent to being trampled on by a swordsman from the outside world. Whether Chenzong did it intentionally or not, this was the truth. Therefore, he had to win this battle. Not only did he have to win, but he had to win beautifully. However, after watching the battle with his own eyes, Tianjianzi was very confident that he would win. Although the defense of the sword circle displayed by Chenzong was amazing, it wasn't really unbreakable. It was just that the Dragon Wave Sword King's ability wasn't up to par. "Jiandi, you're really good. My sword will is soaring." Tianjianzi smiled slightly. The cold light in his eyes was getting stronger and sharper, like an invisible sword stabbing towards Chenzong. An amazing sword will emanated from Tianjianzi's body, like an invisible heavenly sword slashing towards Chenzong. Chenzong also released his own sword will, which collided with Tianjianzi's. In the void, an invisible storm swept out. It was vast and mighty, and there was a faint sound of thunder exploding. "Jiandi, be careful. Take my first sword," Tianjianzi reminded Chenzong. The moment the word sword was heard, the long sword on his back suddenly jumped up. An extremely terrifying sword will gushed out from the long sword, which was emitting a brilliant golden light. It rushed up to the sky like a fountain, and instantly connected with the majesty in the sky. Slash! The golden sword light slashed down from the sky. The moment it fell, it turned into a golden crescent sword light. With an unparalleled sharpness, it slashed the void open mercilessly. Fast, very fast, and it had an amazing sharpness. It was as if nothing between heaven and earth could resist it and would be split open. From this sword, Chenzong felt an amazing aura and conviction. Sharp, unparalleled, indestructible. Suddenly, Chenzong felt a chill all over his body. From the bottom of his heart, he felt that he couldn't resist this sword. All of his defenses would be destroyed. It was a terrifying sword. It was very tyrannical. Tianjianzi didn't make a move. Once he made a move, it was a tyrannical and amazing move. It was as if it could split heaven and earth. From this sword, Chen Zong vaguely felt a trace of the mystery of the 10,000 splitting sword essence. It was obvious that Tianjianzi had also comprehended the 10,000 splitting sword scar, and had gained a lot. The terrifying sword made Chen Zong feel that he couldn't resist it. But Chen Zong's mind was strong and his willpower was extremely tenacious. He knew that it wasn't that this sword couldn't be resisted. It was just that it was integrated with Tianjianzi's conviction and willpower. It was an indestructible conviction and willpower. If his willpower and conviction weren't strong enough, he would be suppressed and feel that he couldn't resist it. Chain. Another sword attack was unleashed. The sword light was like a mountain range, and it flowed endlessly like flowing water. The sword light was faintly discernible, as if it was about to transform into a space-time. Tianjianzi's powerful sword slashed down, and a crescent-shaped sword light shot out, sinking into the chain of sword lights. Instantly, a terrifying power burst forth, shattering many of the chain of sword lights. It continued onward with an irresistible force, causing Chen Zong's heart to palpitate in fear. This power was even more powerful than the sword moves of the Heavenly Sword King. But the chain of sword light had been perfected and improved by Chen Zong again and again. Its power was getting stronger and stronger. While it was being shattered, it was also weakening the power of the crescent-like sword light. Although each chain of sword light could only weaken a negligible part of it, it couldn't withstand too much. The densely packed sword light turned over and over as if it was endless. It directly weakened the crescent-like sword light by a large part. The last sword burst out with an extremely tyrannical power and shattered it. After blocking this sword, Chen Zong didn't have the slightest intention of underestimating Tianjianzi. Instead, he paid more attention to him. The blood in his body seemed to be burning and boiling. His fighting spirit was surging, and the sword essence was raging in his body. It would be impolite not to reciprocate. Chen Zong's eyes flashed. His body suddenly flashed and turned into a flash of lightning. It surged through the 9 heavens and approached Tianjianzi in an instant. His sword broke through the air. Thunder steps of the 9 heavens. Although it wasn't as good as the formless sky wind when used to travel, it had an amazing explosive power when used in a short-distance surprise attack. This sword strike even contained shocking heavenly lightning Dao insight, and when combined with the thunder stamp 9-fold heavens, its might increased greatly. It was like a bolt of divine lightning that traversed through space, and it seemed as if it could shatter space and tear it apart, causing the expressions of others to go pale. Whether it was the profound light sword king or the dragon wave sword king, they were all shocked. They originally thought that Chen Zong was good at defensive sword technique. After all, what he had shown before was a defensive sword technique. They didn't expect his attack to be so amazing. Whether it was the profound light sword king or the dragon wave sword king, their sword essences were at the advanced level. In the entire Shangyuan Sky sword ranking, only Tianjianzi's heavenly sword Dao Will had been comprehended to the top level. This was also one of the reasons why Tianjianzi's strength was always ranked first and was stronger than them. Therefore, Chen Zong's heavenly thunder Dao Will sword strike was so powerful that it surprised the profound light sword king, the dragon wave sword king, and Xiao Tianjian, but it couldn't affect Tianjianzi. He swung his sword. The sword light streaked across the sky like a remnant light. In front of him, it seemed to cut the void apart. A terrifying tearing edge filled the air, shattering the lightning, and seemed to want to cut Chen Zong's body in half. Under the sword strike, the lightning was shattered, and Chen Zong's body scattered. His sword struck down from the sky, fast and fierce like a meteor from outer space. Tianjianzi was a little surprised by this move. Extreme Heart Sword Style. This was the Extreme Heart Sword style. Zong hadn't used it for quite some time, but when it was executed with the Peak Heart Sword Dao intent, the speed of the sword was truly shocking to the extreme. It caused Tian Jianzi to be horrified, and he felt as if the sword had pierced through his head. Tian Jianzi did not dodge. Instead, a shocking aura erupted from his body. His aura was earth-shattering, and it swept across the land like a violent wave. It was terrifying to the extreme, and it even caused the space around him to tremble slightly, as if it was about to freeze. Chapter 1638. A friend is here. I was chatting happily and forgot to update. The golden light was brilliant and dazzling. It suddenly soared into the sky as if it was going to shatter the vault of heaven. At the same time, it attracted the power of heaven in an instant. There was a faint sound of thunder. It was mighty and surging, as if it was going to shatter the earth. Suddenly, a golden light shot down from the sky. It reflected the brilliance of the sword that Tian Jianzi wielded. It attacked Zong from above and below, causing Zong to fall into a predicament. Zong was shocked. It was really amazing that there was such a mysterious sword move. In the face of danger, Zong didn't panic. He looked solemn as he stabbed downward with his sword. His left hand pointed upward like a sword. A sword aura with extreme power broke through the sky as if it was going to pierce the vault of heaven. The sword light surged, bursting out thousands of sword auras. Under the realm of heart, all trajectories were under control. Suddenly, Zong moved slightly. He fell to the same level as Tian Jianzi. He slashed horizontally with his sword, and an amazing killing intent spread out. The killing intent wasn't targeted at anyone. It just spread out from the sword and covered all directions. Under the control of Zong, the killing intent condensed on the blade of the sword. It slashed toward Tian Jianzi as if it was going to destroy all life. Lifeless sword style. Tian Jianzi was shocked. Such a strong killing intent made his hair stand on end. He felt a sense of horror from the bottom of his heart, as if he would die under this sword. Heaven's power! A deep voice suddenly rang out from Tian Jianzi's mouth like a thunderclap. Soon after, Tian Jianzi held his sword with both hands, and golden light suddenly exploded from the sword. It was so dazzling that it filled the surroundings, as if it had seeped out from the void and turned into a boundless golden torrent. Rumble! The sword rose, and the golden sword light seemed to connect the heavens and the earth. In an instant, it triggered the wrath of the heavens, and a world-destroying might descended. The pressure was like a formless mountain, and it also seemed like the sky was about to collapse. The extremely terrifying pressure caused the void below to stop, as if it was being suppressed and solidified into a physical body. Zong could only feel an endless pressure descending from the sky. It landed on his body without reservation, causing his body to freeze in an instant. He felt as if he could not move at all. Furthermore, an extremely terrifying will of the heavens and earth shot down from the sky and rushed towards his divine sea. He could faintly feel the anger it carried. This was like the wrath of the heavens, causing one's heart to tremble. Zong suddenly understood why she was called Tian Jianzi. Such a sword move was truly like a heavenly sword. Chop! After the golden light reached its peak, it suddenly slashed down from the sky. Vaguely, Zong could hear the sound of the sky collapsing in his ears. An extremely terrifying power instantly crashed down. At that moment, the power seemed to want to shatter his soul and tear his flesh and blood apart. Heart Sword Dao essence was pushed to the extreme, and the power of Lingwu erupted. In terms of sword intent, Zong was not inferior to Tian Jianzi. The only thing he lacked was cultivation. Tian Jianzi's cultivation was at the peak of the 9th level Saint Rudiment stage, while Zong was at the peak of the 7th level Saint Rudiment stage. There was a difference of 2 levels. Moreover, Tian Jianzi's cultivation method was also a top-notch Saint grade cultivation method. It was not inferior to the 29th level of the Genesis sword technique. In an instant, the basic strength skyrocketed from the peak of the 7th level Saint Rudiment stage to the peak of the 8th level Saint Rudiment stage. The power of the sword increased greatly, causing the power of the sword to become even more tyrannical. The chop of heavens might seem to fall from the sky, but it was actually coming from Tianjianzi's sword in front of him. Its power was extremely terrifying. It directly shattered the void, leaving a straight and endless sword mark. The edge of the sword mark was broken layer by layer. Chen Zong gathered all his strength and stabbed out with his sword. Endless sword light and sword light wreaked havoc. Waves of tens of thousands of feet high surged and overflowed. Infinite sword. In an instant, tens of thousands of swords tore through the air, as if they were going to shatter space into powder. Every single sword light displayed an extremely shocking profundity, and after they shot out, they instantly condensed into a vast and boundless sword light. It was as if it was capable of shattering space, and its might was boundless and endless. It was as if nothing in the world could resist it. The Profound Light Sword King and the Dragon Wave Sword King were shocked by this sword. How could it be so strong? Shouldn't this person be best at defense? Why did this attack seem to be more terrifying than defense? Tianjianzi was also shocked. He felt that he had overestimated his opponent as much as possible, but he realized that he had still underestimated him. Not only was this sword very mysterious, but its power was also extremely terrifying. The infinite sword collided directly with the chop of heaven's might. It was like a collision of meteorite. The power that erupted in an instant surged through the void, as if it was going to shatter heaven and earth. The void of the 10,000 splitting mountain was originally more unstable than other places. Under the impact of such tyrannical power, fine cracks suddenly appeared. The pitch-black marks quickly spread out, making people's hearts palpitate. The collision of the tyrannical power burst out with astonishing aftershock. It was as if a raging wave swept through heaven and earth. It was as if a torrent of the sea was shaking. In addition to the cracks in the void, Chen Zong and Tianjianzi retreated rapidly. Jiandi is indeed extraordinary. You have exceeded my expectations, Tianjianzi said with a solemn expression. Every word was filled with astonishing power. A mysterious aura filled with the majesty of heavens will spread out from his body. The golden light emitted from his eyes became more and more intense, as if it had turned into two sources of light. It was a shocking sight. Next, let's invite Jiandi to taste the true inheritance of our heavenly sword mountain. Tianjianzi's power surged. His white hair fluttered in the wind. It was as if the sword chi was rising into the air. It danced in the air like 10,000 swords pointing to the sky. His aura grew sharper and sharper, and it was terrifying to the extreme. It was as if he wanted to pierce a hole in the sky, and the golden divine radiance that shot out from his eyes was like two strands of sword chi that pierced through everything and possessed boundless might. With Tianjianzi as the center, the surrounding void was smoothed out by an extremely terrifying power in an instant. It became as calm as a mirror, and there was an indescribable tranquility. Xiao Tianjian and the others retreated to a safe distance. As the successor of the Heavenly Sword Mountain, he knew very well how powerful the inheritance of the Heavenly Sword Mountain was. However, his mastery of the true inheritance of the Heavenly Sword Mountain was still relatively shallow. His master, Tianjianzi, had already mastered it very well. Now that he was displaying it, it was an excellent opportunity for him to learn. Chen Zong stared at Tianjianzi. He was very much looking forward to it. The true inheritance of the Heavenly Sword Mountain? How is it? Tianjianzi's aura became more and more powerful. Vaguely, there seemed to be an illusory aura condensing into a huge sword shadow, suspended in the air behind him. Chen Zong did not move, nor did he take the initiative to attack. He waited for Tianjianzi to accumulate power. Of course, in this state, Chen Zong would find it difficult to attack Tianjianzi. Unless Chen Zong's strength was far greater than Tianjianzi's, he would not be able to break through his sword qi defense and injure him. This was because Chen Zong was very much looking forward to Tianjianzi's attack. This was a kind of expectation for a strong opponent and also a kind of confidence in oneself. Chen Zong was confident that with his ability, no matter how tyrannical his opponent's attack was, it would not be able to kill him. All of this originated from his confidence in his own strength. It was impossible. Gradually, the aura emitted by Tianjianzi made Chen Zong feel threatened. It was already stronger than when he used the Heaven's Might Chop. The illusory sword shadow condensed behind Tianjianzi also became more and more solid. An outline appeared, which could be vaguely seen. Xiao Tianjian stared at it with a very surprised look. Obviously, he was surprised that his master's attainments in the sky sword path had become more profound. At this point, Tianjianzi's expression became more and more serious. A vein gradually bulged on his forehead. He was already giving it his all. But it was not enough. He felt that it was not enough. It was not enough to completely defeat his opponent. Tianjianzi did not forget that he had to thoroughly defeat the other party once he made a move. Using all his strength, the illusory sword shadow behind Tianjianzi condensed a little more. It seemed that the outline could be seen more clearly. The majesty and sharpness it emitted were extremely tyrannical, as if the heaven's might was vast and mighty. Sky sword. Swift. Tianjianzi's body was full of an astonishing aura. It was as if a storm of sword aura was raging around him. His beard and hair were fluttering in anger, and the divine light in his eyes became more and more intense. Immediately, his right hand was like a sword. After drawing a circle in front of him, he pointed at Chen Zong with irresistible force. At the same time, the illusory giant sword behind him also trembled. It seemed that a wisp of sword aura had separated and followed the direction of Tianjianzi's sword finger. That sword aura was almost invisible. It was as thick as a finger. In an instant, it burst out with unparalleled sharpness and shot through the air. The amazing power suddenly surprised Chen Zong, but he also revealed a smile. Happy to see a prey, Chen Zong wanted to test the power of this sword aura. He also wanted to see if there was any difference between this sword aura and Tianjianzi's previous attack. The true inheritance of Sky Sword Mountain. Chain. Suddenly, the sword light spread out. It was densely packed, layer upon layer, as if it was endless. The sword light was like silk, like a cloud, and the sword aura of the sky sword suddenly shot into it. Chen Zong's expression suddenly changed slightly. His face was full of solemnity. The power of that sword aura was not as strong as the heaven's might cut, but it had an indescribable characteristic. It was as if it could not be weakened or broken. It felt similar to the Taichu sword energy technique. Even if its power was not strong enough, it had the characteristics of splitting heaven and earth. It could tear apart all defenses. Of course, the characteristics of this sword aura were different from the characteristics of the Taichu sword energy technique. Under this sword aura, Chen Zong suddenly realized that the chain of sword light could not weaken it much. This was because the sword aura was very condensed. It was condensed to an amazing degree. If the sword light that had weakened the previous sword move was compared to wood, then this sword aura was like steel. There was an essential difference. The chain of sword light could weaken the wooden sword move, but it could only have a certain effect on the steel sword move. The effect was not that significant. That sword aura shot out with irresistible force. It pierced through everything and seemed to want to pierce through Chen Zong's body. For the first time, the chain of sword moves had failed. Chen Zong was shocked. He quickly dodged, allowing the sword aura to pierce through from the side. The terrifying wind swept past with amazing sharpness. It was as if it could cut his face open. It was extremely cold. His figure flashed and turned into a flash of lightning. He rushed toward Tianjianzi and raised his sword. Kill. Sky sword. Tremor. Chapter 1639. The sword chi was like ripples, turning into a tsunami that swept across, scraping the sky layer by layer. The terrifying power spread out, making it impossible for anyone to get close. In the face of this shocking sword wave, Chen Zong's expression was stern. His sword did not turn from attack to defense as others had expected. Instead, he increased the power of his sword and attacked with an indomitable will. The power of the Taichu sword origin technique was pushed to the extreme. Kill. The violent sword wave was torn apart. This sword was like a hot knife through butter. It was as if nothing between heaven and earth could stop it. The sword tore through the air and arrived in front of Tianjianzi. Its shocking sharpness seemed to be about to split him in half. Sky sword. Slash. Tianjianzi's hair and beard fluttered in anger. He raised his sword and struck down. The illusory sword shadow behind him also moved. Suddenly, it trembled and separated into a giant sword shadow. It flew into the air and slashed down. Boom! It was as if the sky was collapsing. The power that erupted in an instant made Chen Zong feel like he was being crushed. Previously, it was the sword chi attack, and its power was shocking. Now, it was a direct slash from the illusory sword shadow. Its power had increased exponentially. It was extremely terrifying. Chen Zong's eyelids twitched unconsciously. He felt like he was about to be crushed. The brilliant heavens might hit his spirit sea directly. It seemed like it was going to collapse. This terrifying sword was much more powerful than the heavens might slash. This sword was too powerful. Moreover, it felt as if even the sky was collapsing. It was as if he was being targeted by the heavens. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. He could only rely on his own willpower and strength to resist. If one's willpower was not enough, they would collapse under this sword. They would not be able to resist and would be suppressed or even killed on the spot. Chen Zong's willpower had always been extremely strong. He resisted the brilliant heavens' might will of the sword and immediately ignited his own strength. Myriad streams force field. Thousands of torrents suddenly rushed into the sky. Under the heart domain, they were more than doubled. They all rushed toward the giant sword shadow. However, the sword image was suffused with an extremely terrifying energy that blocked the torrents. For a time, the myriad flow force field was actually unable to do anything to it even if it was enhanced by the heart domain. Chen Zong was secretly shocked. Since the myriad stream's force field couldn't do anything to him, he could only rely on his own strength to resist. Taichu sword energy technique. The power of Lingwu. Limitless sword. The sword light transformed into an infinite amount of dense layer upon layer, and it traversed through space as if it was boundless. In an instant, it was like a myriad of swords had returned to their source, and all of them converged into an extremely shocking and majestic sword light. It was vast like a mountain, majestic like a river, and it shot out in the sky. After striking out with his sword, Chen Zong immediately activated the non-quenching jade skill, the unbreakable golden body, and the mixed iron forging hand to the extreme. His left palm was filled with golden flames, as if the whole palm was condensed from golden lava. It emitted a monstrous heat that seemed to burn a hole in the sky. Boom! The mixed iron forging hand blasted out with all its might. In an instant it was earth-shattering. The majestic sword light of the limitless sword collided with the heavenly sword image that was slashing down from the sky. After a slight pause, the majestic sword light was instantly split apart and shattered. The heavenly sword image became even more illusory, but it still slashed down with extremely terrifying energy. A palm burning with golden flames blasted out from the sky, as if it was going to shatter the sky, and collided with the heavenly sword image. It was as if the sky was collapsing, and there were waves and waves. The extremely shocking momentum made everyone unable to hear anything. The entire world seemed to be filled with extremely dense golden light. Golden, golden, golden. Extreme, incomparably dense, and endless golden. The golden light also carried with it a terrifying heat that could melt everything and a terrifying sharpness that could tear everything apart. It swept out like a storm. Whether it was Shao Tianjian, the profound light sword king, or the dragon wave sword king, all of them retreated in shock. Otherwise, they could only feel that the golden light that was constantly sweeping out like raging waves was emitting an extremely terrifying power that brought about an obvious threat to them. Wherever the golden flames passed, the void seemed to be torn apart and burned. It was extremely frightening. The figures of Chen Zong and Tian Jianzi were completely submerged and swallowed by the golden flames. They could not see them at all. Even their divine consciousness did not dare to approach them. Otherwise, they would feel an astonishing heat and sharpness that seemed to be burning and tearing their divine consciousness apart. Everyone could only stare and wait. The golden flames continued to set off raging waves and surged out. 1,000 meters. 2,000 meters. 3,000 meters. It only faded and slowly disappeared when it reached a distance of 10,000 meters. After about 30 breaths, the golden flames disappeared into the void. The void within a radius of 10,000 meters seemed to have been deeply cleansed several times. It was clearer and more penetrating than the other parts of the void. It was as if one could see the scene in the depths of the void, but also as if it would be pierced with a gentle poke. It was like the contrast between clear water and muddy water. Two figures stood in the clear void of 10,000 meters. One of them was filled with golden light that burned like flames. It was Chen Zong, who had displayed the unbreakable golden body. Under the detonation of the Lingwu power, his body-refining cultivation had been enhanced, and the power of the unbreakable golden body had increased tremendously, surpassing the limit of LV9 chaotic heaven realm. With such a shocking defensive strength, he was able to withstand the extremely frightening golden flame flow without being injured. As for the other figure, he was surrounded by extremely tyrannical sword qi. The sword qi was like a cage that firmly protected him. It constantly rotated and resisted the impact of the golden flames. However, Tian Jianzi was not as relaxed as Chen Zong. His face was a little pale. Obviously, resisting the impact of the golden flames was a big burden on him. He had consumed a lot of energy, causing his aura to become a little chaotic. The Sky Sword sect is indeed extraordinary. Then, take my sword. Chen Zong smiled slightly, and the golden light on his body disappeared. Then, he raised the sunken knight sword high. Sword qi, sword light, and sword radiance spread all over Chen Zong's body like a divine sparrow spreading its tail. They were densely packed in layers and seemed to be endless. Every single one of them was suffused with shocking light and might. Heaven and earth, these two words rang out from Chen Zong's mouth. Then, countless sword qi, sword light, and sword rays trembled slightly. They were like rivers returning to the sea and thousands of swords bowing to the ancestor. They all poured into the raised sunken knight sword. The black light of the sunken knight sword became deeper and deeper, as if it had turned into a black hole that devoured all the light in all directions. Everyone's eyes were also attracted. They stared and were shocked. They felt as if their eyes and souls were being sucked in, but they could not look away. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Line. The moment the last word fell, the extremely dark sunken knight sword suddenly slashed down like a thunderclap. The straight sword tore a pitch-black sword mark in the void. The surrounding light also dimmed in an instant, as if dusk had fallen. Condensed to the extreme, the sword ray broke through the air like a thread. In an instant, it tore through thousands of meters and attacked Tian Jianzi. Creepy. This was the first feeling Tian Jianzi had. He felt as if he was about to be torn apart. There was no way to resist that kind of sharpness. Everyone in the distance narrowed their eyes, and their hair stood on end. They were horrified. Although they were far away, they felt as if they would be split apart by this sword, along with their souls. Sky Sword. Cut. Tianjianzi did not dodge, nor could he dodge. He stimulated the last of his strength. His sword fingers pulled, and a terrifying aura shook in all directions. He raised his sword fingers high, and suddenly, the giant sword shadow behind him trembled. It was no longer separated from the sword energy, but seemed to rush out of the scabbard. As Tianjianzi's sword fingers slashed forward, it suddenly rushed out and slashed in the air. Cut. The last blow. The strongest blow. Facing Chen Zong's line of heaven and earth, Tianjianzi had to do this. He directly pulled out the giant sword shadow and slashed it. Its power was much stronger than the sword energy slash. The sky seemed to collapse and fall directly, but the pitch-black sword ray of line of heaven and earth seemed to be unaffected. No matter what, it was completely torn apart, and it went forward with an indomitable will. The pitch-black sword ray and the giant sword shadow collided, and both burst out with amazing power. The sword ray of line of heaven and earth wanted to tear the giant sword shadow apart, while the giant sword shadow wanted to shatter the sword ray of line of heaven and earth. But both sides were very powerful. Line of heaven and earth had the characteristic of tearing everything apart, while the giant sword shadow had the characteristic of being incomparably solid. For a moment they were in a stalemate. Line of heaven and earth could not tear the giant sword shadow apart, and the giant sword shadow could not shatter line of heaven and earth. The two unique skills were like two peerless swordsmen fighting against each other. Chen Zong turned into a thunderbolt and rushed to Tianjianzi in a flash. His sword slashed through the air, as if the divine thunder had penetrated the void universe. Tianjianzi's face suddenly changed. After line of heaven and earth was displayed, Chen Zong did not need to control it, and he could use his sword again. But Tianjianzi could not. He had to control the sky sword. If he gave up, the sky sword would go out of control. If the sky sword went out of control, it would not be able to withstand the terrifying pitch-black sword light of the opponent. Master! Xiao Tianjian suddenly shouted. Although he had only scratched the surface of the sky sword doctrine, he was aware of its disadvantages. Seeing Chen Zong's sword strike, he suddenly became anxious. In a moment of desperation, he pulled out his sword and slashed through the air. The sword light was like a crescent moon, tearing the void apart, showing amazing power. He did not hold back in this sword strike, because Chen Zong was very strong. If he held back, Xiao Tianjian did not know if he could block Chen Zong. Xiao Tianjian's sword arrived to block Chen Zong, but it was defeated by Chen Zong's sword strike. Xiao Tianjian's strength was not weak, but compared with Chen Zong, there was still a big gap. Stop! Tianjianzi suddenly said, I admit defeat. He had to admit defeat. After all, even his own disciple had made a move. If he did not admit defeat, what was the point? Master! Xiao Tianjian was stunned and even more depressed. Did he lose? Since Tianjianzi admitted defeat, Chen Zong naturally would not attack with his sword again. This battle was won. No sword cultivator in the Saint Realm and the entire Upper Yuan realm could match him. Chapter 1640. 3,000 meters away from the 10,000 split sword scar, Chen Zong paused to comprehend it carefully. He had comprehended many mysteries here before, but was interrupted by the profound radiance Sword King. Now, he continued to comprehend. In the sky, Tianjianzi and the others were silent. Defeated. All of them had lost. All of them had lost. Whether it was the third-ranked Profound Radiance Sword King, the second-ranked Dragon Wave Sword King, or the first-ranked Tianjianzi, they had all been defeated by Chen Zong. Moreover, they had taken turns to fight Chen Zong. To put it bluntly, it was a battle of attrition. Under the battle of attrition, the top 3 swordsmen on the Shangyuan Sky sword ranking had been defeated one after another. This was undoubtedly a heavy blow to the swordsmen of the Upper Yuan realm. Xiao Tianjian had suffered an even greater blow. They were both of the younger generation, but Chen Zong had defeated the top 3 swordsmen of the Shangyuan Sky sword ranking. Xiao Tianjian's full-powered attack had been easily shattered by Chen Zong. The gap was too big. It was almost hopeless. The news of this battle could not be concealed at all. Soon, it would spread throughout the Upper Yuan realm. Farewell, both of you. Tian Jianzi seemed to be thinking about something. He seemed to be in a daze. When he came back to his senses, he said something to the Dragon Wave Sword King and the Profound Radiance Sword King. Then, he rode his sword light and left quickly with his disciples. Let's go. The Profound Radiance Sword King said coldly. He looked back at the 10,000 split sword scar unwillingly. Then, he turned into a dazzling sword light and flew away. The Dragon Wave Sword King did not leave. Instead, he stayed where he was and quickly headed for the 10,000 split sword scar. It had been a long time since he had comprehended the 10,000 split sword scar. Since he was here, he might as well comprehend it again. After this battle and witnessing the fierce battle between Chen Zong and Tian Jianzi, the Dragon Wave Sword King felt that he had gained a lot. He planned to use the mysteries of the 10,000 split sword scar to improve himself. The Dragon Wave Sword King was extremely fast. Soon, he was 3,000 meters away and stopped to comprehend. Chen Zong sensed the Dragon Wave Sword King's arrival, but he ignored him and continued to comprehend. Then, he took a step forward and continued forward. The comprehension at the 3,000-meter mark was already the limit. He needed to comprehend deeper mysteries and greater pressure. 2 kilometers. Chen Zong stopped again and continued to meditate. His successive battles had proven his strength. His defeat of Tian Jianzi made people realize that even the top expert on the Shangyuan Heaven list might not be able to defeat Chen Zong. As for half-step great sage experts, they wouldn't lower themselves to make a move. Next, Chen Zong naturally stayed here and focused on comprehending the 10,000 cracks sword scar. Comprehending without being interrupted was undoubtedly very satisfying. Bit by bit, the mysteries of sword principle lingered in his mind, and many little drops made a mickle. For a moment, Chen Zong had countless vague concepts, but he was not in a hurry to organize them. Instead, he needed to keep accumulating them. When they were accumulated to a sufficient degree, they would naturally trigger a qualitative change. A day later, the Dragon Wave Sword King also took a step forward and stepped into the 2,000-meter mark. Although he lost to Chen Zong, the Dragon Wave Sword King planned to compete with Chen Zong in terms of comprehending the 10,000 cracks sword scar. Chen Zong had no intention of competing with the Dragon Wave Sword King. After all, he was just a loser. Chen Zong continued to comprehend and master the mysteries of the 10,000 cracks sword intent. Chen Zong took another step forward, and the Dragon Wave Sword King's expression changed drastically. 1 kilometer. In the end, Chen Zong stepped into the 1,000-meter mark. He felt that the sword chi and chilling aura were extremely violent and ferocious. He felt like he was about to be torn apart and frozen. It was almost impossible for him to survive. Such power was comparable to an attack close to the pinnacle state. At every moment, Chen Zong had to endure attacks that were close to the Lamita realm. This kind of pressure was different from when he had fought against Tian Jianzi. Back then, it had only been for a short period of time, but now it was for a long period of time, and it was undoubtedly even more shocking. However, if he could withstand it for a long time, the effect on his body would be amazing. However, after about 30 breaths, Chen Zong realized that he could not take it anymore. He could only retreat to the 2,000-meter mark. Only then did the pressure disappear completely. The Dragon Wave Sword King smiled secretly and took a step forward. He had not yet stepped into the 1,000-meter mark. This time, he wanted to challenge and beat Chen Zong. However, when the Dragon Wave Sword King stood at the 1,000-meter mark, his expression changed drastically. He experienced the pressure that Chen Zong had been enduring. In fact, the pressure that he was enduring was even stronger. It felt like he was facing a sword attack that he had used all his strength to unleash. Moreover, it was continuous. However, he could not use his sword to attack. He could only take it head-on. 5 breaths. After just 5 breaths, the Dragon Wave Sword King felt that he was going to collapse. At the 6th breath, he felt like he was going to be killed. He quickly retreated, flying back. As soon as he retreated, he felt the pressure decrease. After retreating to the 2,000-meter mark, the Dragon Wave Sword King felt like digging a hole to hide in. Embarrassing, really embarrassing. He wanted to suppress Chen Zong, but in the end, he realized that he was not qualified to be compared to him. That kind of pressure was extremely difficult to withstand for every breath, and his opponent had withstood it for 30 breaths. With such a huge gap, what was there to compare? For a moment, the Dragon Wave Sword King was defeated. Chen Zong did not know about this. After resting for a while at the 2,000-meter mark, he stepped forward again. Once again, he reached the 1,000-meter mark and faced the extremely violent Sword Will and Inchil head-on. At a distance of 1,000 meters, the Sword Qi and the Cold Aura seemed to have solidified. The willpower contained within them was incomparably strong. This time, Chen Zong exceeded his limit. He withstood it for 31 breaths before retreating. Once, twice, thrice. Chen Zong continuously challenged the 1,000-meter mark, which shocked the Dragon Wave Sword King. He finally understood why he lost. Just this kind of willpower was not something he could compare to. Thinking of this, the Dragon Wave Sword King felt ashamed. He wanted to rely on his longer cultivation time to suppress his opponent. Taking a deep breath, the Dragon Wave Sword King pulled himself together. He was also a sword cultivator and had a strong enough will. If his opponent could do it, why couldn't he? After regrouping, the Dragon Wave Sword King stepped forward again, reaching the 1,000-meter mark to withstand the tyrannical pressure. At the 6th breath, the Dragon Wave Sword King had no choice but to retreat. 32 breaths, 33 breaths, 34 breaths. Chen Zong endured the pressure at the 1,000-meter mark for longer and longer. His comprehension of the myriad splitting Sword Will and Inchil will also deepened. 40 breaths. 40 breaths seemed to have reached the limit. Chen Zong tried many times, but he could not break through the limit. At the 2,000-meter mark, Chen Zong pondered for a moment before taking out a sword gleam. The sword gleam was filled with shocking sword intent. As it fluctuated, it seemed to tear the void apart. Myriad splitting sword gleam. The Dragon Wave Sword King was attracted by the sword intent fluctuation. This was a rare treasure that had miraculous effects on comprehending the myriad splitting sword will. Immediately, the Dragon Wave Sword King was envious. Unfortunately, the myriad splitting sword gleam was in Chen Zong's hands. He did not dare to snatch it. Holding the myriad splitting sword gleam, Chen Zong began to comprehend it. The myriad splitting sword gleam contained extremely strong and clear sword scars. As soon as Chen Zong comprehended it, he immediately broke through his current limit and took another step forward. As he meditated, the scattered spiritual lights in his mind began to gather bit by bit. The Taichu sword origin technique circulated naturally. As countless inspirations emerged, it gradually reached the limit of the 29th level. Gradually, a trace of indescribable sharpness spread out and filled Chen Zong's body. It fluctuated endlessly, causing the Dragon Wave Sword King to be secretly shocked. Was he about to break through? He was already so strong. If he broke through, wouldn't it be even more terrifying? The 29th level of the Taichu sword origin technique was circulated to the extreme. Countless inspirations emerged one after another like a fountain. The various mysteries of the mystic technique were also separated and recombined. Everything was progressing in a better direction. Gradually, a new circulation path was opened up, as if some kind of boundary between heaven and earth had been broken. The aura around Chen Zong's body increased sharply in an instant. The astonishing sharpness tore everything around him apart. Even the myriad splitting sword gleam and the cold aura would be shattered in an instant. As he comprehended, the myriad splitting sword gleam in Chen Zong's hand continued to shrink, and the sharp aura around Chen Zong grew more and more tyrannical. There was a sharpness that could tear the void apart, making it difficult to look directly at. Is he really breaking through? The Dragon Wave Sword King was even more surprised. He couldn't even imagine how strong Chen Zong would be if he broke through again. Even the top expert on the Shangyuan sky ranking wouldn't be his match. As for the half-step Great Saint, the gap between them and the Saint Realm was huge. No matter how strong a Saint Realm expert was, they wouldn't be a match for a half-step Great Saint. This had always been the case since ancient times. But the Dragon Wave Sword King suddenly thought of something. It seemed that in the legends, all the peerless geniuses of ancient times had the experience of fighting against half-step Great Saint experts when they were at the Saint Realm. Then, Chen Zong was the current Jiandi. He was more outstanding than those peerless geniuses of ancient times. It didn't seem impossible for him to fight against a half-step Great Saint expert when he was at the Saint Realm. He can't do it yet. After all, his cultivation hasn't reached the limit of the Saint Realm, the Dragon Wave Sword King said to himself. Suddenly, a peerless sharpness erupted from Chen Zong's body. It was like the Genesis sword gleam that could split heaven and earth. It instantly made the Dragon Wave Sword King close his eyes. He vaguely felt a stabbing pain in his eyes, as if a sharp blade had slashed across them. It was very uncomfortable. The peerless sharpness that erupted in an instant made him feel as if his body was being torn apart hundreds of meters away. Terrifying. Incomparably terrifying. The charm of tearing the void and splitting heaven and earth had a feeling that originated from ancient times. Chen Zong's entire person seemed to have turned into a peerless divine sword. Nothing in the world could withstand his sharpness. Breakthrough. The Genesis Sword Technique's 30th level. Chapter 1641. Under the 10,000 splits sword scars, countless sword chi surged, and countless cold auras spread. When they neared Chen Zong, they were all split apart and dispersed. The Dragon Wave Sword King narrowed his eyes and stared at Chen Zong. He could vaguely see a sword light around Chen Zong. The sword light seemed formless, but it also seemed to exist. It was like a Taichu sword light that had slashed out from the chaos, splitting the chaos and creating heaven and earth. However, it was faintly discernible. It had just taken shape, but it was already so shocking and terrifying. The potential of the Taichu sword origin technique seems to be beyond the superb saint level, Chen Zong said to himself as he sensed it carefully. Generally speaking, even if it was a top saint level cultivation method, after cultivating to the 30th level, the characteristics of the cultivation method would clearly appear. Some powerful superb saint-level cultivation techniques would even show some characteristics before reaching the 30th level. The characteristic of the Taichu sword origin technique was its extreme sharpness, as if it could split the heavens and earth apart. The lower the level, the less obvious it was. At the 29th level, it was rather obvious. Now that the 30th level was complete, the characteristic was even more obvious and powerful. However, Chen Zong felt that the technique intent wasn't complete yet. Generally speaking, a superb saint-level cultivation technique would be able to grasp the complete technique intent after reaching the 30th level. However, His Taichu sword origin technique intent only seemed to have grasped a small part of it. When the technique intent was complete, it meant that the cultivation technique's power had reached its peak. Might and might were two different concepts. Might represented direct power, while might not only represented power, but it also represented potential. Could it be that the Taichu sword origin technique wasn't as simple as a superb saint-level cultivation technique, but was already a peerless saint-level cultivation technique when it was created? After all, he had created the Taichu sword origin technique based on the Dexian origin technique, and there was a large element of luck involved. He had only completed it with the guidance of the primordial world fragment in the Savage Baron's secret dimension. It couldn't be considered his own creation, but a coincidence. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that it had such high intent and potential. However, for him, there were only advantages and no disadvantages. This meant that it would be easier for him to create the 31st level and even the subsequent levels of the cultivation method, reaching the true limit of this cultivation method. Now that he had completed the 30th stage of the origin sword technique, his strength had improved significantly even though his cultivation base was still at the peak of the 7th heaven saint realm. He should be able to break through his previous limit and stay at 1,000 meters for a longer period of time. However, before that, his cultivation seemed to have reached the true limit. He could try to break through first. If he could break through, his strength would increase again. Immediately, Chernzong took out a large number of heaven origin pills and shattered them. They turned into extremely pure and dense heaven and earth origin chi that surrounded his body. Controlled by his heart domain, the heaven and earth origin chi did not disperse at all. Instead, the heaven and earth origin chi surrounded Chernzong. The 30th level of the Genesis sword energy technique was fully activated. Immediately, the extremely dense yuan qi of heaven and earth that seemed to be on the verge of turning into liquid surged into Chernzong's body. Like a whale sucking in water, it was directly absorbed and devoured. Refine. The heaven and earth origin qi contained in the heaven origin pills was quite pure. Ordinary cultivators could directly convert it into saint energy without refining it. However, Chernzong's saint energy was extremely pure, so he still needed to refine it. However, the refining efficiency of the 30th level of the Taichu sword origin technique was extremely shocking. Very soon, the energy of the heaven origin pill was completely absorbed by Chernzong. He felt his aura fluctuate and was on the verge of a breakthrough. Chernzong divided his attention and took out another batch of heaven origin pills to shatter. Absorb. Breakthrough. In an instant, it was as if a torrent had burst through a dam, breaking through all obstacles. A series of shocking roars rang out from his body. A terrifyingly sharp aura that seemed to be able to tear through everything in the world spread out once again. It was even more powerful than before. The Dragon Wave Sword King's eyes widened. There was only one thought in his mind: I've broken through again. After breaking through twice in a row, his aura had also increased twice. No one knew how much his strength had increased. Despair. It was truly despairing. Living in the same era as such a person, even if they were not of the same generation, they would still feel despair. At this moment, the Dragon Wave Sword King clearly understood how those Sky Prides who had faced Chernzong in the past felt. Bitterness in his heart. Early 8th level Saint Realm. He had finally broken through in his Qi cultivation stage. His basic strength had been significantly improved, and his overall strength had also become more powerful. Feeling the powerful saint energy in his body, Chernzong was confident that if he had fought with Tianjianzi with this level of cultivation, he would have been able to destroy his opponent's Sky Sword Principle and defeat him with the power of the Lingwu. Now, it's time to test my limits, Chernzong thought to himself. Looking ahead, a light flashed in his eyes. He got up, stepped forward, and stepped forward. Soon, Chernzong had stepped into the 1,000-meter range again. The violent pressure that was originally powerful enough to push him back seemed to have weakened a lot at this moment. In fact, the pressure here was still as strong as before. However, Chernzong was no longer the same as before. The breakthrough in his cultivation technique and cultivation base had increased his strength significantly, and he could better withstand the pressure here. Chernzong realized that not only could he withstand the shocking pressure here, but he could also divide his attention to comprehend. The Dragon Wave Sword King stared closely at Chernzong. He wanted to see how long Chernzong, who had broken through twice in a row, could last at the 1,000-meter range. It was certain that Chernzong would break through the previous limit, but it was hard to say how much he would improve. After all, he had experienced it himself. With every breath he took, the pressure was almost suffocating, and he almost collapsed. 30 breaths, 40 breaths, 60 breaths. Time flew by, and the Dragon Wave Sword King was even more shocked. He was still holding on. How could he be so strong? Chernzong, on the other hand, was comprehending the mysteries here bit by bit, accumulating bit by bit. Time passed slowly, and the Dragon Wave Sword King was a little numb. In the blink of an eye, another day had passed. Although Chernzong could withstand the pressure at the 1,000-meter range, he couldn't really do it all the time. After about an hour, he had to retreat to recover his strength before he could continue comprehending. Half a day later, the time extended even further. At this moment, a sword ray emitted an incomparably shocking sharpness and shot out from the depths of the 10,000 splits sword scar. It was so fast that it seemed to pierce through heaven and earth. 10,000 splits sword ray. With a flash of light in his eyes, Chernzong didn't wait for his strength to fully recover before he attacked. He unsheathed his sword, and layers of sword light swept out like a cleansing circle, instantly encircling the sword ray. It fell into his hand, and he temporarily sealed it with his own strength before storing it in his storage ring. The Dragon Wave Sword King could only watch with envy. However, even if he made a move, he couldn't snatch it from Chernzong, so he could only give up. In the sky, a sword ray swept past at an extremely fast speed, and it fell straight into the 10,000 splits sword scar without stopping. After the sword ray fell to the ground, a figure was revealed, and everyone was secretly surprised. Wasn't that Xiao Tianjian, ranked 11th on the Shangyuan Sky Sword ranking? He's here again? Could it be that he's here to challenge Jiandi Chernzong? Even his master Tianjianzi was defeated, and he was no match for him, so he shouldn't be here to challenge him. Xiao Tianjian stared ahead, locking onto Chernzong from afar, and quickly moved forward. He seemed to want to challenge the 10,000 splits sword scar to see where his limit was. Xiao Tianjian's talent and potential were still very good, but he wasn't strong enough at the moment. At the 7,000-meter mark, Xiao Tianjian had to stop and rest for a while. At this point, he already felt a great pressure constantly assaulting him, and it was a little difficult to continue. However, as if he thought of something, Xiao Tianjian forced himself to continue, and reached the 6,000-meter mark. After another period of adaptation, Xiao Tianjian moved forward again. 5,000 meters. This was where his limit was, because when he tried to move forward, he felt like he was going to be torn apart by the violent pressure in front of him. Even at the 5,000-meter mark, he couldn't stop for long before his strength was rapidly consumed. Your Excellency Jiandi, my master has something to invite you to, Xiao Tianjian said loudly. Your Excellency Jiandi, please come to the Sky Sword Mountain for a gathering. Where's your master? Chernzong's voice came. Tianjianzi was defeated by his sword, so he should come in person to invite him. Your Excellency Jiandi, my master originally wanted to come in person to invite you, but after his battle with you, he comprehended something and couldn't leave. Therefore, he sent me here to ask for your forgiveness, Your Excellency Jiandi. Xiao Tianjian's attitude was very respectful. He couldn't help it. After witnessing Chen Zong's strength and amazing swordsmanship with his own eyes, he couldn't help but be convinced. Chen Zong didn't immediately respond, but he was thinking. Why did Tian Jianzi want to invite him to the Sky Sword Mountain? Chen Zong was also clear about it. Chen Zong had a feeling that they didn't have bad intentions. Xiao Tianjian didn't urge Chen Zong. An invitation was an invitation, and it was up to Chen Zong to decide whether to go or not. He couldn't force him. Sometimes being too hasty would have a negative effect. Chen Zong didn't think for long before he decided to go. Chen Zong was very curious about the Sky Sword sect, and so was the Sky Sword Mountain. Moreover, even if Tian Jianzi wanted to deal with him, he wasn't powerless to fight back. One had to know that Chen Zong's main body had gained quite a lot of benefits from the enlightenment of the sword scar of myriad splits. His strength had increased, and his Azura doppelganger had also gained quite a lot of benefits. Now, Chen Zong was confident that he could even face a half-step great sage expert. Moreover, he felt that this trip to the Sky Sword Mountain wasn't a bad thing. Chen Zong got up and left the 10,000 splits sword scar. Lead the way, Chen Zong said calmly as he walked past Xiao Tianjian. Xiao Tianjian also breathed a sigh of relief. He vaguely knew why his master had invited Jiandi. Unfortunately, he wasn't strong enough to participate. If he was as strong as his master wouldn't need to invite anyone else. He only needed the two of them. However, he didn't know how many years it would take for him to be as strong as his master. Therefore, his master could only invite others first. Originally, his master was waiting for the Dragon Wave Sword King and the Profound Radiance Sword King. However, there was now a better candidate than the Dragon Wave Sword King and the Profound Radiance Sword King, and that was Jiandi Chen Zong. Jiandi Chen Zong was very strong, even stronger than his master. With him, his master's trip would be safer. Chapter 1642. The weather is so cold. My hands are cold when I'm writing. My face is numb from the cold after taking a walk outside. The sky was boundless and blue. It was so boundless that it made one feel relaxed and happy. The heavenly wind blew majestically. There was no beginning and no end. As time passed, the sky was still the same sky and the wind was still the same. A streak of sword light controlled the sky, drawing the most beautiful trajectory as it galloped between the heavens and the earth. It flew forward rapidly, breaking through the sky and the heavenly wind, its sharpness shocking the heavens. The wind was formless and colorless. However, one could vaguely see a figure following the sword ray and observing it. Under the envelopment of his heart domain, Chen Zong increasingly felt that his opponent's sword-controlling sky technique was extremely exquisite. It looked like he had condensed the sword ray under his feet. It was as though he had become one with it. However, Chen Zong could not see the mystery behind it. After all, it was the Heavenly Sword Mountain's legacy. Chen Zong was very interested in the Heavenly Sword sect's Heavenly Sword principle. Without a sword in hand, he could release such a powerful force just by condensing the sword's shadow. It was really amazing. In the battle with Tian Jianzi, the power of Tian Jianzi's last slash was close to the supreme stage. Chen Zong also felt that it was not the limit. It seemed like it could be even stronger. Xiao Tianjian's sword manipulation technique was very fast. It was faster than most 9th-level Saint Rudiment stage martial artists. However, Chen Zong was not slow either. In fact, he could be faster. Soon, the two of them flew out of the 10,000 Cracks Mountain and passed through a vast forest. They continued to move forward. They crossed a wide river and continued to head east. That was the direction where the sun rose. Gradually, Chen Zong acutely sensed a sword qi. The sword qi seemed very weak. However, it had a majestic force. It was as though it was above all living things and connected to the sky. The sword qi was not directed at anyone, It had always been like this since ancient times. It traversed between heaven and earth. Gradually, the sword qi became stronger and stronger. Chen Zong also saw a mountain standing between heaven and earth. The mountain was like a huge ancient sword, pointing to the sky. Heavenly Sword Mountain. Chen Zong thought to himself as an extremely sharp light flashed in the depths of his eyes. Immediately after, Chen Zong made an unexpected discovery. Xiao Tianjian's aura seemed to be gradually resonating with the enormous Heavenly Sword Mountain. On second thought, this seemed to be quite normal. Xiao Tianjian was the successor of Heavenly Sword Mountain. He cultivated the legacy of Heavenly Sword Mountain, so it was normal for him to have some connection with Heavenly Sword Mountain. Chen Zong wondered if the members of the Sky Sword Mountain would receive an additional boost in strength and become even stronger if they fought in the Sky Sword Mountain. The closer they got to the Sky Sword Mountain, the clearer the fluctuation of the sword qi became. Chen Zong was able to clearly sense that every single blade of grass, every tree, every rock, and every grain of sand on the mountain contained an extremely shocking fluctuation of sword qi. Even though it wasn't very strong, yet when combined together, it was capable of erupting with an extremely terrifying might that seemed capable of piercing through the sky and shattering the sky. It's really a holy land of swordsmanship, Chen Zong thought to himself. If he were to cultivate and comprehend for a long time, the effect would not be much worse than the 10,000 cracks sword scar. The Sky Sword Mountain was 4,900 meters high. At the top of the mountain there were 2 thatched huts. They looked very simple, but Chen Zong could sense that every blade of grass on each of the huts contained a trace of sharpness. It was the aura of sword qi. Generation after generation of Tian Jianzi and his disciples cultivated and comprehended swordsmanship here. Over time, they were infected by the waves of sword qi and were imprinted in it. Furthermore, the thatch that was used to build the thatch hut was not ordinary. Whether it was in terms of toughness or hardness, it was comparable to fine steel swords and sabers. After countless years of being soaked and imprinted by sword qi, it was not inferior to some low-grade spiritual artifacts. Of course, this was of no use to Saint Realm powerhouses. It would only make them feel extraordinary. Jiandi Mountain, your presence brings light to my humble dwelling. An old but vigorous voice sounded. It was Tian Jianzi's voice. This old master comprehended something after the battle with Jiandi. I was afraid that I would miss the opportunity, so I sent my disciple to invite Jiandi. Please forgive me for my rudeness. It's okay. Chen Zong did not mind. He stared at Tian Jianzi, who walked out of the hut, and asked unhurriedly, "But I wonder why Tian Jianzi has asked me to come here?" Tian Jianzi would not have asked him to come here for no reason. There must be an important purpose. "Jiandi, please," Tian Jianzi did not say directly. Instead, he gestured with his hand and invited Chen Zong into the hut. The interior of the hut was very simple. There was an ancient-looking wooden table with an oily surface. The color was simple and deep, and it had an ancient charm. On both sides of the table were 2 dark futons. It was unknown what kind of grass they were made of, but they emitted a faint fragrance that refreshed one's mind. Tian Jianzi and Chen Zong sat on a praying mat across from each other on an antique table. Immediately, Chen Zong felt a refreshing aura emanating from the praying mat, causing him to feel refreshed and his thoughts to become clearer. "Jiandi, how much do you know about Heavenly Sword Mountain?" Tian Jianzi asked slowly. Chen Zong shook his head. If he had not come to the Upper Yuan realm, he would not have known about Heavenly Sword Mountain. After all, the profound Yuan realm and the Upper Yuan realm were 2 different realms. There was also the sinking bone abyss between them, which separated countless people. In addition, Chen Zong had many things to learn and improve. Therefore, he did not have the time or energy to learn about other realms. Unless, of course, there was a target. Heavenly Sword Mountain's orthodoxy has been passed down since ancient times, but it was cut off during the ancient war. Tian Jianzi explained concisely. His voice was calm, but it was as if he was showing Chen Zong a picture scroll. It made Chen Zong feel as if he was there to witness the rise and fall of Heavenly Sword Mountain with his own eyes. Chen Zong suddenly had a deeper understanding of Heavenly Sword Mountain after listening to Tian Jianzi's narration. He was also surprised. There were only two people in a sect in every generation. One was the sect master, and the other was the disciple. It was a little strange that the master and the disciple had been passed down without any change. If the Heavenly Sword Mountain did not have such a rule and instead accepted disciples, perhaps their inheritance would not have been cut off during the ancient war. However, there was a reason for everything. This was not something that Chen Zong should consider. It was also not something that Chen Zong could control. The current Heavenly Sword Mountain can no longer be compared to before the ancient war, Tian Jianzi said with a long sigh. Before the ancient war, Heavenly Sword Mountain had an ultimate Great Saint Realm expert. That was when Heavenly Sword Mountain was at its peak and it was famous throughout the world. However, that ultimate Great Saint Realm expert left and entered the void of the universe to explore. Many years had passed, and no one knew if he had fallen or something else, but he never returned. Although Heavenly Sword Mountain did not have another ultimate Great Saint Realm expert after that, there were still top half-step Great Saint Realm experts in every generation. They could be ranked among the top half-step Great Saint Realm experts in every generation. Their strength was amazing, and the Heavenly Sword principle that they inherited was terrifying and mysterious. Although there were very few successors in the Sky Sword Mountain and it was simply insignificant compared to other sects, the ratio of powerhouses was astonishing. At the very least, every successor of the Sky Sword Mountain would become a top half-step Great Sage powerhouse in every generation. However, after the ancient war, all the successors of Heavenly Sword Mountain died in battle, causing Heavenly Sword Mountain's orthodoxy to be cut off. It was only after the ancient war that someone obtained the inheritance by chance and reopened Heavenly Sword Mountain. However, the inheritance was no longer complete. The Heavenly Sword principle is divided into two parts. The upper part is the foundation, and the lower part is the essence of Heavenly Sword Mountain. Tian Jianzi said with a solemn expression, "I used the upper part in my battle with you not long ago. However, the lower part was lost in the ancient war." Chen Zong was shocked. The Heavenly Sword principle inheritance that Tian Jianzi used had amazing power, but it was only the upper part. It was really amazing. However, on second thought, although the Heavenly Sword principle that Tian Jianzi used was not weak, it was a little too simple. It was normal that it was only the foundation part of the upper part. My master, who was the previous Tian Jianzi, searched many times and flipped through various ancient books and finally found some clues. Tian Jianzi's expression became more and more solemn. In the ancient times, every Tian Jianzi would be buried in the same place after they died. It was called the Ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb. After over 1,000 years of continuous searching, my master finally found the location of the Ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb. He entered it alone, wanting to find the complete inheritance of the Sky Sword Way and revive the Sky Sword Mountain. Unfortunately, the Ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb was too dangerous. Not only did my master fail to find the lower half of the Sky Sword Way, he even died there. Chen Zong vaguely understood the purpose of Tian Jianzi's invitation. "I have inherited my master's last wish. One day I will revitalize Heavenly Sword Mountain. Now my cultivation and strength have reached a limit, and there is no possibility of a breakthrough. Unless I find the lower part of the Heavenly Sword principle and practice the complete Heavenly Sword principle, I can go one step further and become a half-step Great Saint expert. There is hope to revitalize Heavenly Sword Mountain and repeat the glory of the ancient times." Tian Jianzi had a solemn expression on his face. His eyes shone with an extremely bright light, containing a great ambition and will. It's just that the ancient heavenly sword tomb is too dangerous, and half-step great saints can't enter it. Therefore, I can only look for a saint realm partner. Originally, I was waiting for the Dragon Wave Sword King and the Profound Light Sword King, but unfortunately, after so many years, their strength hasn't improved. If they enter the ancient heavenly sword tomb rashly, their lives will be uncertain. This time, Jiandi came from the east, and he is stronger than this old master. He is the best choice for this old master to travel with him. Therefore, this old master is shameless enough to invite him. Tian Jianzi stared at Chen Zong with sparkling eyes, full of hope and expectation. He continued, "The ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb is the burial place of Heavenly Sword Mountain's experts. I don't know how many years have passed, and I don't know how many experts' corpses are there. However, this old master is sure that there are many inheritances in it. This old master only needs the Heavenly Sword principal inheritance of Heavenly Sword Mountain. As for the other inheritances, Jiandi can take as much as he can. They all belong to you." Chen Zong didn't answer immediately, but his heart was beating fast. Chapter 1643. Under the blue sky, white clouds drifted as the wind blew. The clouds were illusory and formless, and the mysteries were indescribable. The Sky Sword Mountain had been standing tall since ancient times. No matter how the wind and rain blew, it had never collapsed. Even when its inheritance was cut off, it still stood tall and proud. Now, its orthodoxy had been passed down again. The ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb sounded like a destination, but it was actually a secret realm created by a supreme saint expert of the ancient Heavenly Sword Mountain. In other words, it was a different space that was attached to the spiritual martial sacred world. If one wanted to enter it, they needed a special method. Only the people of the Sky Sword Mountain knew this method, and that was the first part of the Sky Sword principle. In other words, if one did not cultivate the first part of the Sky Sword principle to a certain level, even if one knew where the ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb was, one would not be able to open it. Where was the ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb? At that very moment, 3 figures were rapidly descending into Sky Sword Mountain. This was because the ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb was located in the deepest part of the Sky Sword Mountain. Tian Jianzi, Xiao Tianjian, and Chen Zong were rapidly falling. The deeper they went, the darker it became. It felt like they were falling into a bottomless abyss. Chen Zong felt that the height of their fall should have exceeded the height of the Sky Sword Mountain, but they still had not reached it. 10,000 meters. After falling about 10,000 meters from the top of the Sky Sword Mountain, Chen Zong saw the land. Although the light here was extremely dim, it could not block the gaze of Chen Zong and the other 2. "It's here." Tian Jianzi pointed ahead. His eyes shone with a sharp light, and he was secretly excited. There was a stone wall in front of him. The stone wall was flat, as if it had been carved out by a sword. It looked incomparably smooth, and there was a sword mark in the middle. The sword mark was surrounded by countless lines, which looked messy and disorderly, but it also contained an indescribable mystery. The stone wall exuded an extremely ancient charm. No one knew how long it had been there, but it seemed to be extremely hard. Chen Zong knew that even if he performed the line of heaven and earth with all his might, he would not be able to leave any marks on it. This is the Heavenly Sword Wall. It was created by the great saint stage powerhouses of the Heavenly Sword Mountain in ancient times. It is also where the entrance to the ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb is located, Tian Jianzi introduced excitedly. Chen Zong nodded and stared at it. He felt that the sword mark contained an indescribable profundity, but he couldn't tell exactly what it was because it was too profound and unfathomable, and it far surpassed his current level in the Sword Tao. When the gap between realms was too great, it would be difficult for him to comprehend anything even if it was placed in front of him. Chen Zong looked through the lines next to the sword mark. He also felt that they were very mysterious, but he couldn't figure out anything about them either. Sir Jiandi, I'm going to open the ancient heavenly sword tomb, Tianjianzi said with a solemn expression. Chen Zong and Xiao Tianjian stepped back. This time, Xiao Tianjian certainly wouldn't follow them into the ancient heavenly sword tomb because he wasn't strong enough. If he entered rashly, the possibility of death was too high. As for the purpose of coming here, of course, he was here to take care of it. If there was a chance, then the last wish of revitalizing the heavenly sword mountain would fall on him. He needed to be more prepared. Boom! A tyrannical aura suddenly exploded from Tianjianzi's body. The sword aura was endless, as if it had turned into a terrible storm, crushing and destroying everything around it. However, the earth and mountain walls here were extremely tough. Tianjianzi's aura exploded with full force, but it couldn't cause any damage at all. Chen Zong was shocked that he couldn't even leave a trace. Heavenly sword. Tianjianzi's eyes emitted a terrifying divine light. His beard and hair fluttered in anger, as if they were in the mighty wind. Every strand of his hair was condensed into an astonishing sword aura that could penetrate everything. Tianjianzi was fully urging his own strength to display the heavenly sword path. An illusory giant sword suddenly condensed behind him. The light in his eyes was extremely strong, like a small sun. His forehead bulged, and the illusory heavenly sword behind him became more and more solid. He was doing his best. It seemed that he was squeezing out every bit of his strength. Heavenly sword, go! Tianjianzi used his fingers as a sword guide. He drew a mysterious trajectory in the void, pointing straight ahead. The giant illusory sword behind him trembled and flew out quickly. It seemed to be slashing at the heavenly sword wall, but in fact it wasn't. The giant illusory sword instantly approached the heavenly sword wall and imprinted on the sunken sword mark. The size of the mark was just right, as if it had been dug out from the top. It fit perfectly. Inlay. Chen Zong only felt that the heavenly sword wall seemed to tremble slightly. Immediately after, the patterns around the heavenly sword imprint seemed to light up one by one. They emitted a light that seemed to be silver and gold at the same time. It was as dazzling as divine radiance. There seemed to be a cracking sound. Immediately, in the divine light, the mark of the heavenly sword opened little by little to the left and right, as if a door was being pushed open. A ray of astonishing sharpness leaked out from the opened gap. As soon as it appeared, Chen Zong and the other two trembled, as if they were being torn apart. Moreover, that ray of sharpness contained a deathly stillness and paleness, as if it came from the 9 serenities of hell. A touch of grayish-white divine light rippled, attracting the attention of the 3 people. Open! Open continuously! It didn't stop until the crack on the heavenly sword wall was about half a meter wide. Your Excellency Jiandi, let's go, Tianjianzi said in a deep voice. He leaped, turned into a ray of sword light, and rushed toward the crack on the heavenly sword wall. In the blink of an eye, Tianjianzi disappeared into the crack. Chen Zong didn't hesitate either. His figure shook slightly, turned into a gust of wind, and disappeared into the crack with Tianjianzi. Xiao Tianjian stared at the crack on the heavenly sword wall, resisting the urge to break into it. A gray aura spread in all directions, as if the world had just been created, but it was filled with a deathly stillness, as if there was no vitality. Immediately, Chen Zong heard a shout coming from the front. Then, his whole body tensed up, and his scalp tingled slightly. A wisp of grayish-white sword energy shot through the air, but it was silent. If it weren't for his superhuman perception, he wouldn't have been able to detect and react in an instant. He unsheathed the sunken knight sword and slashed it in the air, shattering the cold grayish-white sword energy. Chen Zong moved forward quickly. The shout just now was a little hurried. It was Tianjianzi, and the situation didn't seem good. After a breath, Chen Zong saw Tianjianzi, who was being attacked by the cold grayish-white sword energy, and was having a hard time coping with it. He swung his sword. Chen Zong immediately shattered several sword energies, relieving the pressure on Tianjianzi. Your Excellency Jiandi, please help me resist. I need to recover my strength, Tianjianzi said quickly. Okay, Chen Zong replied immediately. In order to open the ancient heavenly sword tomb, Tianjianzi had used all his strength to display the heavenly sword path, so he didn't have much strength left. Now that he had stepped into the tomb, he was attacked by a lot of sword energies. Usually, he could resist, but when he didn't have enough strength, it was inevitable that he would struggle. Moreover, who knew if he would encounter other dangers later? Therefore, it was necessary to recover his strength. As a companion, Chen Zong naturally had to bear the corresponding responsibilities and obligations. This was the meaning of companionship. Otherwise, Tianjianzi could have entered and explored by himself. Why would he need to find someone else to enter the secret realm of the Heavenly Sword Mountain and reap the benefits inside? The previous generations Tianjianzi had gone in alone without any companions to rely on. That was why he had perished. However, Tianjianzi didn't know that in ancient times, the people of the Heavenly Sword Mountain wouldn't encounter any danger when they entered the ancient Heavenly Sword Tomb. After all, this was the place where the experts of the Heavenly Sword Mountain were buried after their death. It was a cemetery, a place of rest. However, as the inheritance was cut off for too long, some changes had occurred here, and danger had appeared. The grayish-white sword energy seemed to come from the depths of hell. Although the power of each strike wasn't very strong, it could be completely blocked and shattered. However, if one was hit, there would be bad consequences. Chen Zong definitely wouldn't let them hit him. With the deep night sword in hand, Chen Zong blocked and shattered all the grayish-white sword energy, no matter how many of them there were. They couldn't hurt Chen Zong at all, nor could they affect Tianjianzi, who was behind Chen Zong. Tianjianzi had already made sufficient preparations. He had prepared a large amount of energy recovery and healing elixirs. At this moment, he was taking some energy recovery elixirs and using all his strength to restore his strength. He trusted Chen Zong with his safety. At this moment, if Chen Zong had any evil intentions, he didn't need to do it himself. He only needed to release 1 or 2 grayish-white sword energies, and Tianjianzi would be buried here. However, Chen Zong wouldn't do that. This wasn't his way of doing things. If he agreed, Chen Zong would do his best to fulfill his promise. Only then would he not go against his conscience. Under the protection of Chen Zong, Tianjianzi's strength was constantly recovering. The elixirs he had obtained over the years were all of the best quality. The effects were amazing, and the side effects were minimal. Therefore, after about half an hour, Tianjianzi's strength was completely restored. Thank you, Your Excellency Jiandi. I have recovered. Tianjianzi stood up. A strong aura spread from his body. His eyes shone with a strong light. He casually pointed and a sword energy shot out, shattering the grayish-white sword energy. So, what should we do now? Chen Zong asked. The ancient heavenly sword tomb was the tomb of the fallen experts of the Sky Sword Mountain. It was a secret realm belonging to the Sky Sword Mountain. Only the people of the Sky Sword Mountain knew enough about it. He was an outsider. If he hadn't been invited by the current Tianjianzi, he wouldn't have known much about the Sky Sword Mountain, let alone the ancient heavenly sword tomb. Perhaps after countless years, the inheritance of the Sky Sword Mountain had been lost, and their understanding of the ancient heavenly sword tomb was also lacking. However, on the whole, they knew more about it than he did. More or less, some guidance was better than running around like a headless fly and encountering all kinds of dangers. Tianjianzi didn't answer. Instead, he carefully observed the surroundings. His eyes shone with a divine light. The aura on his body fluctuated like a tide. He seemed to be sensing something. Immediately, Tian Jianzi stared at a place. Although it still looked gray, he said without hesitation, "Your Excellency Jiendi, this way." As soon as he finished speaking, Tian Jianzi immediately led the way forward. Chernzong hurriedly followed. Once they entered this place, the dangers were unpredictable. It was better not to separate. If they acted together, it might be safer. Chapter 1644. Inside the ancient heavenly sword tomb, it was foggy as if it was the beginning of the chaos. Chernzong and Tian Jianzi worked together and were extremely vigilant. In fact, compared to Tian Jianzi, Chernzong was safer because his heart domain spread out and covered a radius of 2 kilometers. Everything was within Chernzong's perception. Even if his eyes couldn't see anything, he wouldn't be affected. Awe-inspiring grayish-white sword energy appeared from time to time, as if it had a mind of its own. It sensed the fluctuations of the two's vitality and attacked, but Chernzong and Tian Jianzi blocked and shattered it. It couldn't hurt the two at all. Forward! Under Tian Jianzi's perception, the two kept moving forward. After about 2 hours, they finally walked out of the foggy area. What appeared in front of them was graveyard after graveyard. Each graveyard was thousands of meters apart. At a glance, the graveyard stretched into the distance as if there was no end. Chernzong was shocked. He didn't know how many fallen experts of the Sky Sword Mountain were buried here. Thinking about it, every generation of the Sky Sword Mountain only had the sect master and the disciple. Then, there seemed to be many graveyards here, and he didn't know how many years they had been passed down. According to this old man's understanding, there are more than 200 graveyards in the ancient heavenly sword tomb, Tian Jianzi said. In other words, more than 200 sword experts of the Sky Sword Mountain were buried here. Chernzong's heart was burning with excitement. The true inheritance of the Sky Sword Mountain was the Sky Sword Principle. He didn't need to think about it. It was the inheritance of the Sky Sword Mountain. Unless he joined the Sky Sword Mountain, he wouldn't be able to obtain it. But in the current situation, it was impossible for him to become a member of the Sky Sword Mountain. However, aside from the Sky Sword Principle, any Sword Dao expert would definitely have more than just one Sword Dao. There would definitely be others. His goal was to obtain other inheritances to strengthen his Sword Dao foundation and accumulate more experience in Sword Dao. The two didn't stop and walked to the first graveyard. The graveyard was very simple. It looked like a mound of dirt, but it was very hard. It was impossible to break through. A tombstone stood in front of the graveyard like a large sword. The tombstone was pitch black, and there were large golden words written on it. Tomb of the 420th Tian Jianzi of Sky Sword Mountain. The Sky Sword Mountain had been passed down from generation to generation. Some generations were longer, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of years, but some were shorter, only a few decades. Even in the short span of 100 years, more than 400 generations were enough to show how ancient the Sky Sword Mountain was. Perhaps it would be difficult to find an orthodoxy more ancient than the Sky Sword Mountain in the current Tianyuan sacred region. After all, during the first large-scale invasion of the Void Demons in the Antiquity Age, countless experts had fallen in that battle. Countless sects and clans had been destroyed, and their inheritances had not been passed down, disappearing in the long river of history. Even if there were some that had been passed down, their appearances had actually changed, and they were no longer the same as before. Only the Heavenly Sword Mountain's inheritance was missing. However, it did not lose the elegance and rules of the ancient era. If you want to count my generation, it should be after the 500th generation. Tian Jianzi sighed and said, after the Great Ancient War, the successors of the Sky Sword Mountain all died in battle. After the Great Ancient War, someone else regained the opportunity. It has been thousands of years since then. In fact, after the Great Ancient War, the generations of the Sky Sword Mountain were already difficult to distinguish. Therefore, the person who re-established the Sky Sword Mountain defined himself as the 500th generation. The Tianjianzi in front of Chenzong was the 557th generation, and Xiao Tianjian was the 558th generation. So now, how was he going to obtain the inheritance? Chenzong had no idea. Was he going to break into the graveyard? The Tianjianzi probably wouldn't allow it. After all, this was the resting place of the Tianjianzi of the past. The 557th generation of disciples of the Sky Sword Mountain has come to ask for the lower part of the Sky Sword Path. Tianjianzi stood in front of the tomb. He calmed his mind and concentrated his aura. His sword chi rose up, faintly filling the air with an indescribable power, as if the power of heaven was vast and mighty. This tyrannical power gradually moved forward, covering the tomb. He carefully sensed it as he spoke. His voice was steady and contained a unique rhythm. It was as if he was on a pilgrimage. Chenzong stood dozens of meters away from him. He did not disturb him, but looked on with interest. Would this method work? I don't know. Looking at Tianjianzi's expression, it seemed that he was not sure. He was probably just taking a gamble. Gradually, Tianjianzi's aura seemed to connect with the aura of the tomb, producing a resonant fluctuation. The sword-shaped tombstone trembled slightly, as if a sword was ringing. Then, a tyrannical aura burst out from the tomb and soared into the sky. That sword chi was filled with a thick deathly stillness and a trace of ominous. Soon after, an illusory figure emerged from the graveyard. As it appeared, countless auras swept over like a storm and poured into the illusory figure, causing it to solidify. It looked like a person, but its skin was grayish-white, and its clothes were tattered. The aura it gave off was extremely strange, and its eyes were deathly white. It seemed like its eyeballs were rolling, and when it looked at them, Chenzong and Tianjianzi's expressions changed slightly. They felt a chill run down their spines. It was like the gaze of death, filled with an endless deathly aura. The 537th generation of disciples of the Sky Sword Mountain. Tianjianzi gathered his thoughts and opened his mouth again. But before he could finish his words, the figure filled with a deathly stillness waved his hand, and a gray longsword with a broken and deathly aura appeared in his hand. The longsword slashed through the air, and a deathly stillness sword chi suddenly shot out like a crescent moon breaking through the sky. This sword chi was very sudden, and its power was amazing. Tianjianzi was startled, and he quickly unsheathed his sword and slashed out. This is the sword principal ghost. Tianjianzi narrowed his eyes slightly and stared at his opponent with a dignified expression. The sword principal ghost. Chenzong was slightly startled, and he recalled that there seemed to be such a record in the ancient books he had read in the past. After the death of some sword principal experts, under special circumstances, their remaining souls would condense into sword chi and continue to condense into a physical form. They would master various sword techniques and sword principles from their previous lives, and their strength would be tyrannical. The power they mastered would not be the original power, but a kind of deathly stillness power, which was very terrifying. As for the strength of the sword principal ghost, it was closely related to the time of its birth and existence. The longer it existed, the stronger it would be. According to the ancient books, there seemed to be a sword principal ghost at the level of the great saint realm. It was in existence at the king level, and it was very terrifying. It was more terrifying than most great saint realm experts. After all, the deathly stillness of the sword principal ghost's death power had a terrible destructive and corrosive effect on living creatures. Judging from the sword principal ghost's strength was not weak at all. However, Tianjianzi should be able to deal with it. Fight. Chenzong did not make a move. Instead, he stared at the sword principal ghost to see how powerful it was. The sword principle ghost had mastered the sword techniques and sword principles from their previous lives, but it was not necessarily all of them. It could be all of them or it could be a part of them. If it was all of them, of course, it would be very powerful. Tian Jianzi did not display the sky sword principle, but fought fiercely with other sword technique. The sword qi swept in all directions, and the aftermath slashed the tombstones and graves. However, it did not cause any damage, and it was difficult to even leave a mark. After about a quarter of an hour of fierce fighting, Tian Jianzi directly slashed with his sword, and immediately defeated the sword principle ghost. After the sword principle ghost was defeated, something fell. It was a white crystal about half the size of a palm, and its shape was like an irregular sword tip. Tian Jianzi opened his hand and grabbed the crystal in the void. He carefully sensed it, and immediately showed a touch of disappointment. Your Excellency Jiandi, this is not the inheritance of the sky sword principle. According to the agreement, it is yours, Tian Jianzi said as he threw the crystal to Chen Zong. After Chen Zong caught it, he sensed the fluctuations of the breath inside. It was a sharp, amazing sharpness that seemed to be able to tear everything apart. Besides this sharpness, there was nothing else. It was very pure. Sometimes it was strong and sometimes it was weak. However, after seeing the sword principle ghost's sword technique, Chen Zong knew that the sword technique inherited in the crystal was not weak. Without hesitation, Chen Zong immediately accepted the inheritance. Sky Edge Sword Technique. This was a sword technique. Chen Zong didn't know whether it was created by the undead swordsman or obtained from somewhere else, but he didn't need to know. However, this was indeed a very good sword technique. It was as if the sharpness of the sword was explained to the extreme. It didn't take long for Chen Zong to decipher the profundity within and quickly comprehend it. Tian Jianzi, on the other hand, stood guard at the side to prevent any unexpected situations, such as other sword Dao undead. In just a short quarter of an hour, Chen Zong opened his eyes, and a ray of sharp light shot out. Tian Jianzi was secretly shocked. In fact, it was not that Tian Jianzi was not interested in it. Of course, he was eager to accumulate more sword principle. However, his cultivation path was different from Chen Zong's. More importantly, of course, was the continuation of the sky sword principle. Different cultivators had their own paths. Although it was right to learn from others, not all learning was worth it. Sometimes it would disturb oneself. Only those who walked the path of Chen Zong, who had the strong points of many schools, needed to learn from others to accumulate. This ancient heavenly sword tomb was obviously a good opportunity. There were more than 200 graves here, and more than 200 experts of the Sky Sword Mountain were buried here. The previous grave was only the first. Continue to search. I don't believe that I can't find the complete inheritance of the Sky Sword principle. In the second grave thousands of meters away, Tian Jianzi stood still again and spoke with a solemn expression. He emitted his own sword principle aura to communicate with it. Immediately, the second sword principle ghost appeared. Fleeting. This sword principle ghost's figure was very fleeting, like a ghost, and it was difficult to grasp. For a moment Tian Jianzi could not deal with it. Fortunately, the sword principle ghost's strength was not as good as Tian Jianzi's. After Tian Jianzi grasped the pattern of the sword principle ghost, he killed it. A white crystal fell. Again, this crystal belonged to Chen Zong, because it did not contain the aura of the sky sword principle. This was an inheritance of a movement technique called Phantom Shadow. Chen Zong only received the inheritance and did not cultivate it. Instead, he treated it as a kind of accumulation. Chapter 1645. Inside the ancient heavenly sword tomb, a deathly aura filled the air. It was extremely cold, as if the power of hell was trying to invade Chen Zong and Tian Jianzi's bodies and devour their vitality. However, both Chen Zong and Tian Jianzi had enough strength to resist it. Chen Zong, in particular, had vigorous qi and blood. He also had the purple blaze of devastation, so he could completely resist the corrosion and remain unharmed. The two of them visited sword tombs one after another, and Tian Jianzi killed the spirits one after another. However, they still didn't obtain the inheritance of the Sky Sword sect. However, the crystals that were left behind all belonged to Chenzong, and Chenzong had accumulated more because of this. The 18th Sword Tomb. Tian Jianzi performed the same ritual as before, and the spirit of the sword sect appeared again. "Leave it to me this time," Chenzong said. After 18 consecutive battles, Tian Jianzi had consumed a lot of energy. As a companion, Chenzong had also gained a lot of benefits, so he had to help. Tian Jianzi nodded and retreated, taking an elixir to recover his strength. The spirit of the sword sect didn't care who it was, and directly attacked with its sword. The grayish-white sword light emitted a strong deathly aura, and it instantly cut through the sky. The sunken knight sword was unsheathed, and a pitch-black sword light flashed. It was as if the night was pervading. It had a kind of understatement, but it also had a kind of amazing sharpness that seemed to be able to tear through everything. The power condensed by the 30th level of the Taichu sword energy technique was even more amazing. In addition to the continuous accumulation, the power condensed in Chen Zong's sword became more and more tyrannical, and the sharpness of the sword was interpreted as much as possible. Tian Jianzi observed while recovering his strength. He was secretly shocked. Jiandi had become stronger. Tian Jianzi only sighed and exclaimed in his heart. No wonder he was the current Jiandi, a peerless genius recognized by the king-naming pagoda. His talent was really amazing. As long as he grasped the slightest opportunity, he could continuously improve. However, there was no comparison between people. Chenzong used the unbreakable sword circle and used his opponent's sword techniques to sharpen his unbreakable sword circle. At the same time, he observed his opponent's sword techniques and absorbed their essence. Only when he had more or less grasped the other party's techniques did he launch a counterattack. With a slash of his sword, the sword tore through the sky like a black bolt of lightning. In an instant it slashed across and killed the other party. Unfortunately, the sword principle undead did not leave behind the inheritance of the Sky Sword doctrine, so its crystals naturally belonged to Chenzong. With such an agreement, Chenzong wouldn't feel embarrassed. However, he would do his best to help Tian Jianzi find the inheritance of the Sky Sword sect. Worst comes to worst, I'll just wipe out all the Sword Dao undead in the Sword Tomb. Tian Jianzi took a deep breath. He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed, but he still plucked up his spirit and continued to explore. The 19th Sword Tomb. The 20th Sword Tomb. The 21st Sword Tomb. One sword tomb after another, the sword principle undead fell under Chenzong's sword one after another. However, perhaps they didn't really fall. After a period of time, they would condense in the sword tombs and reappear. However, it would take a long time. After that, Chenzong seemed to be addicted to fighting. He constantly fought with the sword principle undead, constantly experiencing the sword principles of the sword principle undead, and honing himself. The people buried here were all powerhouses of the Sky Sword Mountain. Most of them were half-step great saints. Although the sword principle undead were not their original bodies, they still grasped part of their original body's abilities. When they displayed it, it was very shocking. It laid a stronger foundation for Chenzong's sword principles. Vaguely, Chenzong felt as if he was about to break through and create a second ultimate move that was close to the extremity. The extremity. It represented the limit of the way will. It was a level where one's power was completely unearthed. It was very powerful. Close to the extremity was a state where one's full potential was unearthed. The power close to the extremity would naturally be more powerful. Of course, depending on the level of the Wei will, its power close to the extremity also varied. For example, there was a clear difference in power between a high-level Wei will and a top-level Wei will in the extremity or near the extremity. The more ultimate moves close to the extremity that one mastered, the more comprehensive the potential of the Wei will would be in all aspects. Perhaps there was a saying that one could conquer the world with a single move, but that was close to a legend. Only by mastering more moves could one deal with everything calmly. Chen Zong planned to use this ancient sword tomb to break through and create a second ultimate move close to the extremity. It didn't matter what kind of sword move it was. The 100th sword tomb. There was still no second part of the sky sword principle. Tian Jianzi became more and more disappointed. His expression was cold. There are still more than 100 sword tombs. I think we'll find them. Chen Zong could only comfort him like this. He took a deep breath to calm his chaotic emotions that were about to become irritable. Yes, there's still a chance. Tian Jianzi's emotions also calmed down, and he moved again. He didn't believe that he couldn't find the second part of the sky sword principle in the remaining 100 sword tombs. If that was the case, it could only mean one thing. The Sky Sword Mountain was not allowed to rise again. However, that shouldn't be the case. Although the Sky Sword Mountain had a long history and a long history of orthodoxy, among all the sects and forces, the overall strength of the Sky Sword Mountain was more ordinary. Even if there was a great Saint Realm expert, it wouldn't affect much. The next sword tomb. Tian Jianzi was now in charge of guiding the Sword Wei spirits of the dead, while Chen Zong was in charge of attacking. Compared to Tian Jianzi, Chen Zong's control of his power was more precise, so his consumption was less. Moreover, Chen Zong often used the unbreakable sword circle to defend against the attacks of the Sword Wei spirits of the dead. When he looked for an opportunity to counterattack, he often saw the opponent's flaws. Therefore, his consumption of power was very small. After dozens of battles, his consumption of power was less than 1/3. Moreover, Chen Zong would take elixirs to recover his consumed power. Under the amazing efficiency of the 30th level of the Genesis sword technique, the elixirs were refined at an astonishing speed. Therefore, Chen Zong maintained at least 90% of his power at all times, which was enough to deal with any unexpected situation. A new Sword Wei spirit of the dead appeared. As soon as it appeared, it released an extremely terrifying storm. The storm was formed by countless sword qi of the dead. It swept in all directions, as if it wanted to devour all of Chen Zong's life force. Chen Zong protected himself, ensuring that his life force didn't leak out, and resisted with all his might. The Sword Wei spirit of the dead suddenly slashed out with its giant sword. The terrifying giant sword light seemed to split the heavens and earth, and it made Chen Zong's hair stand on end. Very strong. It was more tyrannical than any of the Sword Wei spirits of the dead before. It didn't seem to be weaker than Tian Jianzi, and it seemed to be even stronger. This didn't make Chen Zong afraid. On the contrary, it made Chen Zong excited. Let's fight. Let's fight to our heart's content. Tian Jianzi watched from the side, and his eyes were extremely solemn. This Sword Wei spirit of the dead was very strong. If he were in Chen Zong's place, he wouldn't have much confidence in killing it. However, Jiandi's strength was really terrifying. The unbreakable sword circle alone was able to completely resist the opponent's attack, and it was difficult to break through. With Tian Jianzi's eyesight, he could see that Jiandi's unbreakable sword circle was even more exquisite than before. There was a natural flowing charm in it. It felt as if the unbreakable sword circle was about to break through to a whole new level, a whole new realm. How terrifying! Tian Jianzi exclaimed again. No matter how many times it happened, it would always be the same. It was really stressful to be together with such a person. Fortunately, his ambition was to revitalize the Sky Sword Mountain, and he didn't want to compete with the opponent. Otherwise, he would have suffered an even greater blow. This battle lasted for half an hour. The Sword Wei spirit of the dead was indeed very tyrannical, and Chen Zong fought to his heart's content. Infinite sword. Finding a slight opportunity, Chen Zong counterattacked with his sword. The sword light split into tens of thousands of rays, and it was very mysterious. Then, it immediately gathered into one ray, and it pierced out with extreme sharpness. This sword seemed to be the most brilliant and dazzling sword in the world. It was incomparably dazzling. However, this sword didn't succeed. It was blocked by the Sword Wei spirit of the dead. Chen Zong was a little surprised. Being able to block this infinite sword meant that the opponent's strength had indeed reached a very amazing level. Then, what about this sword? Chen Zong had already figured out the Sword Wei spirit of the dead's method. Although it was very strong, it was a little simplistic. After all, it wasn't its original body when it was alive, so there was a gap. As it raised its sword, endless sword light, sword qi, and sword light fluctuated and swept out in an instant. The extremely terrifying aura of sharpness swept out in all directions, as if it wanted to destroy everything. Tian Jianzi's pupils shrank to the size of needles. He was shocked. He recognized this sword. It was the sword that resisted the full strength of his Sky Sword sect and didn't lose. It even had the upper hand. However, he felt that it was much more tyrannical than before. Perhaps it was because Chen Zong's cultivation level and cultivation had both broken through, the power of line of heaven and earth had multiplied. Tian Jianzi knew that even if he activated the Sky Sword sect with all his strength, he definitely wouldn't be able to resist it. A silk-like sword light broke through the air, penetrating everything and tearing everything apart. It was indestructible and invincible. The Sword Wei spirit of the dead used all its strength to swing its sword and attack. However, under line of heaven and earth, it couldn't resist at all and was directly defeated. It slashed. In an instant, the body of the Sword Wei spirit of the dead was split into two. When the powerful Sword Wei spirit of the dead died, a piece of white crystal fell down. It was exactly the same as the previous one. Chen Zong grasped the void and caught it in his hand. After sensing it for a while, an undetectable change appeared on his face. "Congratulations!" Chen Zong looked at Tian Jianzi and smiled. Tian Jianzi was startled at first. Then, as if he had thought of something, he looked at the crystal in Chen Zong's hand. His eyes trembled and he was secretly excited. He couldn't help but tremble all over. "It's yours," Chen Zong's voice fell, and the crystal flew up into the air and was thrown to Tian Jianzi. Tian Jianzi quickly caught it. His hands trembled slightly as he spread his aura to sense it. Immediately, he was overjoyed. Sky Sword Sect. This was the aura of the Sky Sword Sect. Although he wasn't sure if it was complete, at least it was the inheritance of the Sky Sword Sect. Compared to the disappointment of more than 100 times before, this was undoubtedly a kind of hope. Without hesitation, Tian Jianzi began to accept the inheritance. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.